Welcome, friend, to this peaceful journey through the corridors of European history. Tonight, we explore the rise and eventual twilight of one of history's most powerful dynasties. Whether you're settling in for sleep or simply seeking to slow the rhythm of your evening, I'm grateful you're here with me. I'd love to hear where you're listening from, what corner of the world you call home, and what time it is as you press play. It always amazes me how these ancient stories can bring strangers together across centuries and continents. If this kind of gentle historical storytelling brings you comfort, consider subscribing. We have many more tales to guide us into the quiet night. This isn't some romanticized fairy tale from a history book. This was reality in the grand palaces and modest chambers of medieval Europe, where a single family would rise from obscurity to control an empire so vast the sun never set on their territories. Have you ever wondered how one bloodline could maintain power across multiple continents for over 6 centuries? The answer lies in the smoky chambers of Alpine castles and the marble halls of Spanish palaces where political marriages were arranged like chess moves and entire kingdoms changed hands through carefully orchestrated alliances. What I'm about to reveal will transform everything you thought you knew about European power. These weren't just wealthy nobles collecting titles and lands. They were architects of a system so sophisticated that it would influence global politics for generations. Today, I'm going to take you inside the hidden world of Habsburg court life, where every meal was a political statement and every marriage could reshape the map of Europe. You'll witness the daily routines that built an empire and understand why their eventual decline was as inevitable as it was dramatic. By the end of this journey, you'll see medieval and early modern Europe through completely different eyes. But before we enter those torch-lit halls where destiny was decided over elaborate dinners, let me paint you the broader picture of how a minor Swiss noble family became the most powerful dynasty in European history. The morning mist clings to the hills surrounding Habsburg Castle in the year 1273, as Rudolf awakens before dawn in his modest chambers. The stone walls hold the chill of the Alpine autumn, and he can hear the distant sounds of servants beginning their daily preparations in the kitchens below. Rudolf stretches beneath heavy woolen blankets, his breath visible in the cold air as he contemplates the momentous day ahead. Today, he will learn whether the electoral princes have chosen him as Holy Roman Emperor, a position that seemed impossibly distant just months ago. Rudolf's morning routine begins as it has for decades. He kneels on the cold stone floor beside his bed, offering prayers for guidance and strength. The wooden crucifix mounted on the wall catches the first rays of sunlight streaming through the narrow window. His personal chaplain enters quietly, carrying a brass basin of water that has been heated in the kitchens. The water steams in the cool morning air as Rudolf performs his ablutions, washing his face and hands with a coarse soap made from animal fat and ash. His clothing reflects both his noble status and his practical nature. The linen undergarments are clean but simple, changed twice weekly by his personal servants. Over these, he dons a woolen tunic dyed in deep blue, the colour achieved through expensive indigo imported from distant lands. The garment is well made but not ostentatious, suitable for a man who must balance authority with approachability. His leather belt, tooled with intricate patterns by local craftsmen, holds a simple but well-forged dagger, more ceremonial than practical but essential to his noble bearing. The great hall of Habsburg Castle comes alive as Rudolf descends the spiral stone staircase. Rushes cover the floor, mixed with herbs to mask the odours of daily life. The massive hearth dominates one wall, its fire carefully tended through the night by servants who sleep in shifts. Long wooden tables scarred by decades of use are already being prepared for the morning meal. The smell of fresh bread mingles with wood smoke and the earthy scent of the rushes beneath his feet. Rudolf takes his place at the high table, elevated on a wooden platform that allows him to survey his household. His wife, Gertrude, joins him, her own morning routine having included prayers in the castle chapel and consultation with the head cook about the day's meals. She wears a simple gown of fine wool, her hair covered by a white linen veil, held in place by a circlet of silver. Their children, when present, would occupy places of honor, learning through observation the complex protocols that govern noble behavior. The morning meal is substantial, but not elaborate. Fresh bread, still warm from the ovens, is placed before them alongside churned butter made from milk of the castle's own cows. Cheese, aged in the castle's cool cellars, provides protein along with eggs from the extensive poultry yards. Small beer, safer than water, and with low alcohol content, serves as the primary beverage. Rudolf eats methodically, aware that his every gesture is observed by the assembled household members who stand respectfully during his meal. As he breaks his fast, messengers arrive with reports from his scattered holdings. A steward approaches with parchments detailing grain yields from his estates. His careful script recording numbers that will determine whether taxes can be collected or relief must be provided to struggling tenants. Another servant brings news of minor disputes between villages under his protection, conflicts that require his judgment and demonstrate his role as protector and arbiter of justice. The morning's correspondence reveals the complex web of relationships that define Rudolf's position. Letters arrive from fellow nobles, some offering support for his imperial ambitions, others carefully neutral, waiting to see which way political winds will blow. Each message requires careful analysis, not just of its explicit content, but of the subtle implications contained in choice of words, quality of parchment, and the seals employed. Rudolf reads these communications while his secretary, a learned clerk who can write in both Latin and German, takes notes and prepares responses. By mid-morning, Rudolf has moved to his private chambers where he meets with his closest advisors. The room is modest by later standards, but comfortable, with tapestries covering the stone walls to provide both warmth and beauty. A large wooden table, polished smooth by years of use, serves as his desk. Maps drawn on parchment and vellum are spread across its surface, showing his current holdings and the much larger territories that could fall under his authority if the electoral princes choose him as emperor. His advisors are a carefully selected group representing different aspects of governance. His marshal, a grizzled veteran of numerous campaigns, provides military counsel. His chancellor, educated in cathedral schools, offers legal and diplomatic expertise. His treasurer, a man whose mathematical skills are essential in an age when accounting is still developing, reports on the financial resources available for potential campaigns or the maintenance of imperial dignity. The discussion centers on the practical implications of imperial election. If chosen, Rudolf will need to travel to Aachen for coronation, a journey requiring careful planning and significant expense. His household will need to be reorganized to reflect imperial dignity while maintaining the personal loyalty that has sustained his rise. New protocols will govern everything from how meals are served to who may approach him directly with requests or complaints. The afternoon brings physical activity as Rudolf inspects his castle's defences. Walking the battlements, he examines the condition of the walls, noting where mortar needs replacement and where wooden reinforcements require attention. The castle's garrison, modest but well-trained, demonstrates their readiness through weapons practice in the courtyard below. The ring of steel on steel echoes off the stone walls as men-at-arms practice sword techniques that could mean the difference between life and death in actual combat. Rudolf's inspection extends to the castle's economic foundations. The stables house his personal war horses, magnificent animals whose breeding and training represent substantial investment. Each horse is worth more than most peasants will earn in a lifetime, but they are essential tools of war and statecraft. The blacksmith's forge glows red hot as weapons and tools are repaired and improved. The sound of hammering on anvils provides a rhythmic backdrop to conversations about iron quality and the availability of skilled craftsmen. The castle's workshops buzz with activity as artisans create the goods necessary for noble life. Carpenters shape wood into furniture and wagon wheels, their tools simple but effective in skilled hands. Weavers work at looms, creating the cloth that will become clothing and household linens. The complex process of turning raw wool into finished fabric requires expertise passed down through generations, each step critical to producing materials worthy of noble use. As evening approaches, Rudolph returns to the great hall for the day's main meal. The transformation is remarkable, as servants have spent hours preparing for this daily ceremony that reinforces social hierarchy while providing sustenance. Fresh rushes cover the floors, scented with lavender and other herbs gathered from the castle's gardens. Candles and torches illuminate the space, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls and creating an atmosphere of warmth despite the season's chill. The high table is now covered with white linen, one of the household's most precious possessions. Silver vessels, polished to gleaming brilliance, reflect the candlelight. The placement of each item follows strict protocol developed over generations of noble dining. Rudolph's seat, a wooden chair with carved arms and a high back, towers above those of his guests and household members, a physical manifestation of his authority. The meal itself represents a complex ballet of service and consumption. Multiple courses arrive in sequence, each accompanied by specific rituals. Roasted meats, seasoned with expensive spices imported from distant lands, demonstrate the household's wealth and the lord's ability to provide abundance. Vegetables from the castle's gardens, preserved through careful planning and storage techniques, show the foresight necessary for successful governance. Wine, stored in the castle's cellars and carefully rationed according to occasion and season, flows from decorated pitchers into silver cups. The vintage reflects both the castle's location in wine-producing regions and Rudolph's connections to merchants who can provide quality beverages. Each cup is shared according to social rank, with the most honoured guests drinking from vessels that have been passed down through generations. Entertainment accompanies the meal as travelling musicians perform songs that celebrate noble virtue and recount the deeds of heroes from earlier ages. The melodies, passed down through oral tradition, connect Rudolph's household to the broader culture of European nobility. Stories told in verse reinforce values of courage, loyalty, and honour that are expected to guide noble behaviour in both peace and war. As the evening meal concludes, Rudolph retires to his private chambers for the final activities of his day. By candlelight, he reviews correspondence that has arrived during the afternoon, dictating responses to his secretary who will prepare formal documents for dispatch the following morning. Each letter requires careful consideration of both immediate implications and long-term consequences, as words written tonight could influence relationships for years to come. His personal prayers before sleep include gratitude for the day's blessings and requests for guidance in the momentous decisions that lie ahead. The possibility of imperial election weighs heavily on his mind as he contemplates the responsibilities that would accompany such elevation. Tomorrow will bring new challenges and opportunities as the complex machinery of medieval politics continues its eternal dance of ambition and alliance. The castle settles into nighttime quiet as guards take their positions on the walls and servants bank the fires that will smoulder until morning. In chambers throughout the building, members of the household prepare for sleep, each aware that they are part of something larger than themselves, participants in the endless human drama of power and survival that defines their age. The morning light filtering through the tall windows of the imperial palace in Vienna reveals a world transformed. It is now 1519, and the Habsburg dominion has expanded beyond Rudolph's wildest dreams 2.5 centuries earlier. Charles, who will soon be known as Charles V, awakens in chambers that dwarf those modest alpine rooms where his ancestor once contemplated the possibility of imperial election. The walls are covered in tapestries depicting scenes of triumph and conquest. their rich threads catching the early sunlight that streams through glass windows, a luxury that would have been unimaginable in Rudolph's time. Charles begins his day not with simple prayers in a castle chapel, but with an elaborate religious ceremony attended by dozens of courtiers, each position carefully orchestrated according to protocols that have evolved over generations. His personal chaplain is now a bishop, and the morning mass is conducted with the full pageantry of imperial authority. The golden vessels used in the service represent wealth extracted from territories spanning from the Netherlands to southern Italy, from Spain's growing American colonies to the traditional Habsburg lands in Austria. His morning ablutions have become a ceremonial performance involving multiple servants, each responsible for a specific aspect of the emperor's preparation. The water is no longer heated in castle kitchens, but warmed in silver basins that themselves cost more than entire villages might produce in a year. Perfumed oils imported from the Orient replace the simple soap of earlier generations, their exotic fragrances speaking to trade networks that circle the globe. The clothing that adorns Charles reflects an empire where the sun never sets. His undergarments are made from silk that travelled the dangerous routes from China, while his outer robes incorporate gold thread spun from precious metal mined in the New World. The dyes that colour his garments come from sources his ancestors could never have imagined. Deep purples from mollusks gathered on distant shores, brilliant reds from insects cultivated in American colonies that didn't exist when Rudolph first claimed imperial authority. The breakfast table stretches the length of the Great Hall, accommodating not just immediate family, but representatives from every corner of the Habsburg domains. Spanish grandees sit alongside German princes, Flemish merchants beside Italian nobles, each placement calculated to reflect both honour and political necessity. The morning meal has evolved from Rudolph's simple bread and cheese into an elaborate display of imperial abundance. Chocolate, unknown to Rudolph's generation, arrives steaming in golden cups, its bitter richness sweetened with sugar harvested by enslaved hands in Caribbean plantations. Coffee, another innovation from the expanding world of trade, provides stimulation for long days of governance that span multiple time zones. Fruits preserved in sugar syrups demonstrate preservation techniques that allow the imperial table to enjoy strawberries in winter and exotic citrus fruits year-round. The morning correspondence that once consisted of a handful of parchments from neighbouring lords has become an avalanche of communication, requiring an entire bureaucracy to manage. Letters arrive from Spanish viceroys governing territories larger than European kingdoms, from Portuguese traders negotiating agreements in Asian ports, from German princes balancing between French intrigue and Ottoman expansion. Each piece of correspondence represents decisions that could affect millions of subjects speaking dozens of languages across continents that previous generations could barely imagine. Charles reviews these documents in chambers lined with maps that would have seemed like fantasy to Rudolph. Detailed cartographic representations show coastlines explored by Habsburg-sponsored expeditions, mountain ranges crossed by imperial armies, river systems that serve as highways for trade goods flowing toward European markets. The scale of governance required to maintain authority over such territories demands innovations in administration that stretch the limits of 16th century technology and communication. His advisors now include specialists in fields that didn't exist during Rudolph's reign. Military engineers discuss fortification techniques designed to withstand cannon fire that can reduce medieval castles to rubble. Financial experts calculate the flow of silver from American mines, analyzing how New World wealth affects European markets and Habsburg purchasing power. Diplomatic specialists manage relationships with powers that extend far beyond traditional European alliances, negotiating with Ottoman sultans, Portuguese kings, and indigenous rulers from territories that European maps are still struggling to accurately depict. The morning military briefing encompasses theatres of operation that span the known world. Habsburg armies simultaneously defend against French incursions in northern Italy, Ottoman expansion in southeastern Europe, and Protestant rebellions in German territories. Naval forces patrol Mediterranean waters while protecting Atlantic routes that carry treasure fleets from American colonies. The complexity of coordinating such widespread military commitments requires logistical capabilities that push the boundaries of what 16th century administration can accomplish. By midday, Charles moves through palace corridors lined with portraits of ancestors whose modest ambitions seem quaint compared to current imperial responsibilities. The walls display captured battle standards from victories across Europe, ceremonial weapons gifted by Allied rulers, and artistic treasures that represent the cultural flowering enabled by Habsburg patronage. Each object tells stories of expansion, conquest, and the gradual accumulation of power that has transformed a minor Alpine family into masters of a global empire. The imperial kitchen staff numbers in the hundreds, preparing meals that incorporate ingredients from every corner of the Habsburg domains. Spices from newly established trade routes compete with traditional European seasonings, while cooking techniques borrowed from Spanish, Italian, and German traditions create fusion cuisines that reflect the cosmopolitan nature of imperial court life. The logistics of feeding the imperial household and its constant stream of visitors requires supply networks that stretch across continents. Afternoon audiences bring petitioners from territories so distant that their journey to reach the imperial presence has taken months. American colonial administrators present reports on silver mining operations that fund European military campaigns. Flemish wool merchants discuss trade agreements that affect employment from Belgium to Spain. German princes balance religious conflicts that threaten to tear apart the traditional unity of the Holy Roman Empire. Each audience requires careful preparation, as Charles must demonstrate familiarity with local conditions, customs, and political sensitivities across vastly different cultures. The emperor, who once needed to know only the names of neighboring nobles, now must understand the complexities of governing indigenous populations in Mexico, managing religious tensions between Catholics and Protestants in Germany, and maintaining naval supremacy against Ottoman expansion in the Mediterranean. The afternoon inspection of imperial defences reveals military technology that would have amazed Rudolf's generation. Cannon foundries produce artillery pieces capable of breaching walls that once seemed impregnable. Engineers design star-shaped fortifications that can withstand bombardment while providing platforms for defensive cannon fire. The development and deployment of gunpowder weapons has revolutionized warfare, making traditional medieval tactics obsolete while demanding massive investments in new military technologies. Habsburg territories now include some of Europe's most advanced manufacturing centers, producing everything from precision clockwork mechanisms to navigational instruments that enable oceanic exploration. The empire's wealth allows patronage of artists and inventors whose innovations push the boundaries of Renaissance knowledge. Workshops attached to imperial palaces create mechanical marvels that demonstrate Habsburg commitment to progress and learning. As evening approaches, the Great Hall accommodates banquets that would have seemed impossible in Rudolf's era. The high table extends across a space that could hold Rudolf's entire castle, while hundreds of guests represent the geographic and cultural diversity of Habsburg authority. Spanish nobility share tables with German princes, Italian merchants converse with Flemish diplomats, and American colonial representatives observe European court ceremonies that will influence administrative practices in distant territories. The evening entertainment reflects cultural sophistication enabled by imperial wealth and cosmopolitan connections. Musicians perform compositions that blend traditions from across the Habsburg domains, while dancers demonstrate steps learned in Spanish courts, Italian palazzos, and German principalities. The artistic flowering of the Renaissance finds expression in performances that celebrate both Habsburg power and the cultural diversity that empire encompasses. Wine cellars that once held modest local vintages now contain selections from vineyards across the empire, each bottle representing different terroirs and winemaking traditions. Spanish reds compete with German whites, while Italian varieties provide options for every course and occasion. The imperial sommelier's knowledge encompasses geography, climate, and cultural preferences across territories that span multiple continents. The evening's correspondence includes communications that travel by the fastest means available, yet still require weeks or months to reach their destinations. Letters to Spanish viceroys in Mexico or Peru will cross oceans on ships that face storms, pirates, and navigational challenges that make every successful delivery a minor miracle. Communications with German princes must navigate political territories as treacherous as any physical landscape, carrying messages that could influence religious wars, threatening to reshape European Christianity. Charles retires to private chambers, where the weight of empire becomes most apparent in the silence of evening reflection. Maps spread across his writing table show territories so vast that effective governance seems almost impossible. Yet Habsburg administrative innovation continues to develop new techniques for managing unprecedented scale and complexity. The challenge of maintaining unity across such diverse populations and territories requires constant attention to local needs while preserving imperial authority. His evening prayers include gratitude for territories and opportunities that his ancestors could never have imagined, while seeking guidance for decisions that will affect millions of subjects across multiple continents. The responsibility of governing an empire where the sun never sets weighs heavily on a mind that must balance competing demands from Spanish nobles, German princes, Italian merchants, and American colonial administrators. The palace settles into nighttime quiet as guards patrol walls that protect not just an imperial residence, but the administrative heart of a global empire. In chambers throughout the building, secretaries work by candlelight, preparing documents that will carry imperial authority to territories months away by the fastest available transportation. The machinery of empire never truly sleeps. As dawn in European territories coincides with sunset in American colonies, where Habsburg authority continues its endless work of governance and expansion, the morning bells of Escorial echo across the Spanish countryside as Philip II awakens in chambers that represent the pinnacle of Habsburg architectural ambition. The year is 1575, and the empire has reached its zenith of territorial control and administrative sophistication. Philip rises from a bed whose carved wooden frame incorporates precious metals extracted from Peruvian mines, while the mattress beneath him contains feathers gathered from exotic birds in territories that previous generations of Habsburgs could never have conceived of governing. His morning routine begins with prayers conducted in a private chapel, whose altarpiece gleams with gold leaf applied by master craftsmen whose techniques have been refined through generations of imperial patronage. The religious ceremony is attended by clerics whose theological education has been funded by revenues flowing from silver mines in Potosi, sugar plantations in the Caribbean, and spice trades that connect Habsburg territories to Asian markets through Portuguese intermediaries. The emperor's personal hygiene has evolved into an elaborate ritual requiring servants whose specialized training reflects the increasing complexity of court life. Water for his morning ablutions is heated in copper vessels, whose metal has traveled from mines in the Spanish Netherlands, while soaps incorporate oils pressed from olives grown in territories where Habsburg authority maintains peace through carefully balanced alliances with local nobility. His clothing represents the global reach of Habsburg commercial networks. The silk undergarments began as cocoons in Chinese farms, travelled overland routes that connected Asia to European ports, and were woven into fabric by artisans in Italian cities whose loyalty to Habsburg rule has been secured through favourable trade agreements and military protection. The outer garments incorporate wool from Castilian sheep, whose bloodlines have been improved through selective breeding programs funded by American colonial revenues. The breakfast chamber accommodates a gathering that would have overwhelmed the simple great halls of earlier Habsburg castles. Representatives from every corner of the empire share tables whose construction required wood from German forests, craftsmanship from Italian workshops, and decorative elements created by artists whose training has been supported by imperial academies. The morning meal demonstrates the abundance that effective governance can generate when applied to territories spanning multiple continents. Chocolate arrives in forms that showcase the sophistication of imperial food preparation. Master confectioners have developed techniques for transforming bitter cacao beans into delicate sweets, whose flavors have been enhanced through the addition of vanilla from Mexican plantations, cinnamon from Ceylon, and sugar refined in Caribbean mills. Each bite represents supply chains that connect American jungles to European palaces through networks of merchants, administrators, and military forces, maintaining security across oceanic distances. The morning correspondence has grown beyond the capacity of any single individual to manage personally. Secretaries trained in multiple languages sought communications according to geographic origin and political urgency. Letters from American viceroys report silver production figures that will determine funding for European military campaigns, while messages from Italian governors describe diplomatic negotiations with papal representatives whose decisions could affect Habsburg authority throughout the peninsula. Philip reviews these documents while surrounded by maps whose accuracy reflects the accumulated geographical knowledge of explorers, merchants, and military commanders who have extended Habsburg influence into previously unknown territories. Cartographers working in imperial workshops continuously update these representations as new expeditions provide information about coastlines, mountain ranges, and river systems that offer opportunities for further expansion or challenges requiring military response. His morning military briefing encompasses operational theatres that would have seemed impossible to previous generations of Habsburg rulers. Naval commanders report on fleet movements in the Mediterranean, where Habsburg galleys patrol against Ottoman expansion while protecting merchant vessels carrying goods between Italian ports and Spanish bases. Atlantic naval forces guard treasure fleets whose safe arrival determines the empire's ability to finance military operations across multiple fronts simultaneously. The discussion extends to land forces defending frontiers that stretch from the Netherlands to southern Italy, from the Pyrenees to the borders of Ottoman-controlled territory in southeastern Europe. Each theatre requires different tactical approaches, equipment specifications, and supply arrangements adapted to local geographical conditions and enemy capabilities. The coordination of such widespread military commitments demands administrative innovations that push the boundaries of 16th century organizational capacity. By late morning, Philip moves through palace corridors lined with artistic treasures that celebrate Habsburg cultural patronage. Painted portraits commemorate military victories achieved through careful strategic planning and superior resources, while sculptural works demonstrate the technical mastery enabled by imperial investment in artistic education. Tapestries depicting scenes of abundance and prosperity reinforce messages about the benefits of Habsburg rule for subjects willing to accept imperial authority. The Imperial Workshop Complex employs hundreds of artisans whose specialized skills serve both practical and ceremonial purposes. Metalworkers create precision instruments for navigation and timekeeping, their techniques refined through generations of experience with materials and tools that represent the best available technology. Clockmakers produce mechanical marvels whose accuracy enables the coordination of administrative activities across territories, where seasonal variations and geographic distances complicate scheduling. Afternoon audiences bring visitors whose journeys to reach the imperial presence represent the vast distances encompassed by Habsburg authority. Portuguese merchants describe trading opportunities in Asian ports where European goods can be exchanged for spices, silk, and precious stones that command premium prices in European markets. German princes balance religious and political loyalties that are being tested by Protestant Reformation movements, threatening traditional Catholic unity. American colonial representatives present reports on territorial expansion, indigenous relations, and resource extraction operations that provide much of the wealth supporting European imperial activities. Mining engineers describe techniques for extracting silver from mountain deposits, whose exploitation requires massive labor forces and technological innovations adapted to high-altitude conditions. Agricultural specialists report on crop experiments designed to increase food production in territories whose growing populations demand more sophisticated approaches to land management. Each audience requires Philip to demonstrate familiarity with local conditions, cultural sensitivities, and political dynamics across territories whose diversity challenges traditional approaches to imperial governance. The emperor must understand the complexities of managing religious conversion programs in the Philippines, maintaining trade relations with Portuguese merchants in Brazil, and coordinating military responses to French incursions along the Pyrenean frontier. The afternoon inspection of imperial facilities reveals technological capabilities that would have amazed earlier Habsburg rulers. Cannon foundries produce artillery pieces whose bronze construction requires copper from Hungarian mines and tin from English sources, while their operation demands technical expertise that has been developed through systematic experimentation and international knowledge exchange. The weapons produced in these facilities defend fortifications designed according to the latest military engineering principles. Shipyards along Spanish coasts construct vessels whose size and capabilities enable transoceanic voyages that maintain communication and trade between European territories and American colonies. The engineering knowledge required to build ships capable of surviving Atlantic storms while carrying heavy cargoes represents accumulated experience from generations of maritime exploration and commercial expansion. Each vessel launched represents an investment in maintaining the maritime connections that hold the empire together. As evening approaches, the Great Hall accommodates banquets, whose scale and sophistication demonstrate the cultural achievements enabled by imperial wealth and international connections. The dining chamber can hold gatherings that include representatives from every territory under Habsburg control, their conversations conducted in multiple languages, while consuming foods that represent culinary traditions from across the known world. Musicians perform compositions that blend musical traditions from Spanish, Italian, German, and American sources, creating artistic expressions that reflect the cosmopolitan character of imperial court life. Dancing demonstrations incorporate steps learned in different territorial capitals, while theatrical performances present stories that celebrate Habsburg achievements, while entertaining audiences whose cultural backgrounds span continents. Wine selections represent viticultural knowledge accumulated across territories whose climate variations produce beverages suited to different occasions and personal preferences. Spanish vintages compete with Italian varieties, while German wines provide alternatives for guests whose tastes have been shaped by regional traditions. The imperial cellars contain selections that chronicle the expansion of Habsburg authority through territories whose incorporation has brought new agricultural possibilities. The evening's entertainment includes displays of mechanical innovations that demonstrate imperial investment in technological development. Clockwork automata perform complex movements that showcase the precision achievable through careful craftsmanship and mathematical calculation. Optical instruments reveal celestial phenomena that have guided navigation and influenced agricultural planning throughout Habsburg territories. Evening correspondence includes communications, whose preparation and delivery represent the administrative complexity required to govern territories, spanning multiple time zones and seasonal variations. Letters to American colonial governors must account for oceanic travel times that make immediate response impossible, while messages to German princes require sensitivity to religious and political tensions that could explode into warfare, affecting the entire European balance of power. Philip retires to chambers where the accumulated documentation of imperial administration fills rooms whose organization requires specialized staff trained in archival techniques. Maps, reports, legal documents, and diplomatic correspondence represent the paper foundation upon which Habsburg authority rests. The challenge of maintaining accurate information about territories so vast and diverse that complete knowledge seems impossible requires constant attention to communication networks and record-keeping systems. His evening prayers include gratitude for territorial expansion that has exceeded the ambitions of previous Habsburg rulers, while seeking guidance for decisions whose consequences will affect millions of subjects across continents, whose full potential remains largely unexplored. The weight of governing an empire where administrative efficiency must balance local autonomy with imperial unity requires constant attention to competing demands from diverse constituencies. The palace complex settles into nighttime routines that reflect the global scope of Habsburg responsibilities. Guards patrol walls that protect administrative centers, whose decisions influence territories from Mexico to the Philippines, while secretaries work through the night, preparing documents whose delivery will require months of travel, through territories where Habsburg authority must be maintained through careful balance of military force and diplomatic persuasion. In workshops throughout the complex, artisans continue projects whose completion will serve both practical and ceremonial purposes across the empire. The machinery of imperial administration never completely ceases its operations. As sunset in European territories coincides with dawn in American colonies, where Habsburg governors continue their endless work of maintaining order and extracting resources that support the entire imperial structure. The morning sun rises over Vienna in the year 1740, casting long shadows across a palace that has witnessed the gradual transformation of Habsburg power, from territorial expansion to bureaucratic consolidation. Maria Theresa awakens in chambers whose decoration reflects a dynasty that has learned to adapt ancient traditions to contemporary challenges. The empire she has inherited faces pressures that her predecessors could never have anticipated, as emerging nation-states challenge traditional concepts of imperial authority, while new ideas about governance and individual rights spread through territories that once accepted Habsburg rule without question. Her morning routine begins with prayers conducted in chapels whose artistic treasures commemorate centuries of Habsburg achievement. Yet the religious ceremony itself reflects changes in Catholic practice that have evolved in response to Protestant challenges and Enlightenment criticism. The chaplains who conduct morning services have been educated in seminaries where theological studies now include philosophical investigations that would have seemed dangerous to earlier generations of Habsburg rulers. The Empress's personal preparation involves servants whose training reflects the increasing sophistication of court protocols. Yet their techniques must also accommodate practical demands that earlier Habsburg rulers never faced. The clothing she wears incorporates traditional elements that maintain connection to dynastic heritage, while adapting to fashions that reflect changing aesthetic sensibilities throughout European society. Each garment represents choices that balance respect for ancestral traditions with acknowledgement of contemporary expectations. Her breakfast chamber accommodates gatherings that include traditional representatives of Habsburg territories, alongside newer advisors whose expertise reflects the changing nature of 18th century governance. Military officers trained in academies where mathematical precision has replaced traditional martial virtues share tables with civilian administrators whose education has emphasized legal and economic principles rather than classical learning. The conversations conducted during morning meals address challenges that require innovative solutions to unprecedented problems. The morning correspondence has evolved beyond simple territorial administration to encompass complex international negotiations that must balance competing national interests with traditional dynastic claims. Letters arrive from diplomats managing relationships with emerging powers, whose legitimacy rests on popular support rather than hereditary authority. Communications from territorial governors describe social changes that challenge traditional hierarchies, while creating opportunities for administrative innovation. Maria Theresa reviews these documents while surrounded by advisors whose expertise reflects the diversification of governmental responsibilities. Legal scholars, trained in universities where Roman law has been supplemented by studies of contemporary jurisprudence, provide counsel on matters that previous Habsburg rulers would have decided through personal authority. Economic specialists, whose knowledge encompasses international trade, manufacturing development, and agricultural improvement offer recommendations based on systematic analysis rather than traditional precedent. The morning military briefing addresses strategic challenges that extend beyond traditional territorial defense to include protection of commercial interests and maintenance of political influence in territories where Habsburg authority must compete with emerging forms of national consciousness. Naval forces must protect trade routes while adapting to technological innovations that have revolutionized maritime warfare. Land armies require reorganization according to tactical principles that emphasize disciplined formations and coordinated artillery support rather than individual heroism. Heroism. The transformation of military organization reflects broader changes affecting every aspect of Habsburg governance. Artillery specialists trained in mathematical academies calculate trajectories and powder charges with precision that would have amazed earlier generations, while engineers design fortifications according to geometric principles that combine defensive effectiveness with economic efficiency. The cost of maintaining such sophisticated military capabilities requires revenue collection systems that penetrate deeper into territorial economies than traditional feudal obligations ever demanded. By midday, Maria Theresa moves through palace corridors where portraits of ancestors remind her daily of the weight of dynastic expectation. Yet the challenges she faces require responses that previous Habsburg rulers never needed to consider. The traditional balance between imperial authority and local autonomy has been disrupted by ideas about natural rights and popular sovereignty that spread through territories where educated populations increasingly question the foundations of hereditary rule. Her afternoon audiences bring visitors whose concerns reflect the changing nature of 18th century society. Merchant representatives describe commercial opportunities that require governmental support for infrastructure development, banking innovation, and legal standardization across territories whose traditional diversity has become an obstacle to economic integration. Manufacturing specialists propose industrial development programs that could increase territorial wealth while creating employment for growing urban populations. Educational reformers present plans for expanded schooling systems that would improve administrative efficiency while potentially creating populations capable of questioning traditional authority structures. Religious leaders struggle to balance Catholic doctrine with philosophical challenges that have gained credibility among educated elites throughout Habsburg territories. Each audience requires careful consideration of how innovation can be embraced without undermining the stability that has sustained Habsburg authority for centuries. The afternoon inspection of imperial facilities reveals technological developments that have revolutionized both military and civilian capabilities. Workshops produce precision instruments whose accuracy enables more effective territorial surveying, while manufacturing centers experiment with mechanical processes that could increase production efficiency across various industries. The challenge of funding such innovations while maintaining traditional governmental responsibilities requires financial planning that pushes the boundaries of 18th century economic understanding. Administrative offices throughout the palace complex employ hundreds of clerks whose record-keeping systems have evolved far beyond the simple documentation that satisfied earlier Habsburg rulers. Detailed statistical compilations track population changes, economic production, and tax collection across territories whose complexity demands systematic analysis rather than personal knowledge. The bureaucratic machinery required to govern 18th century Habsburg domains represents organizational innovations that previous generations could never have conceived. As evening approaches, the Great Hall accommodates social gatherings that reflect the intellectual sophistication of Maria Theresa's court. Philosophers whose ideas challenge traditional concepts of authority share conversations with scientists whose discoveries have revolutionized understanding of natural processes. Artists whose techniques incorporate Renaissance innovations with contemporary aesthetic sensibilities create works that celebrate Habsburg patronage while acknowledging changing cultural values. The evening entertainment includes musical performances that demonstrate the cultural flowering enabled by Habsburg investment in artistic education. Composers whose training has exposed them to influences from across Europe create works that blend traditional forms with innovative harmonic progressions. The complexity of such musical compositions reflects the sophisticated tastes of audiences whose education has extended far beyond the classical learning that satisfied earlier generations of Habsburg courtiers. Wine selections for evening meals represent viticultural knowledge that has been refined through systematic experimentation with grape varieties, cultivation techniques, and aging processes. The imperial cellars contain vintages whose production has benefited from scientific understanding of fermentation while maintaining connection to traditional regional characteristics. Each bottle served represents the balance between innovation and tradition that characterizes Maria Theresa's approach to governance. Evening correspondence includes communications that must address increasingly complex international relationships. Diplomatic negotiations require sensitivity to emerging concepts of national sovereignty while maintaining Habsburg claims based on traditional dynastic inheritance. Trade agreements must balance protection of territorial economic interests with recognition that commercial prosperity depends on international cooperation rather than imperial domination. The challenge of governing territories where traditional authority structures face philosophical and practical challenges requires constant adaptation of administrative methods. Legal systems must evolve to accommodate new concepts of individual rights while maintaining social order. Tax collection systems must balance revenue needs with recognition that excessive demands could provoke resistance from populations whose political consciousness has been awakened by Enlightenment ideas. Maria Theresa retires to private chambers where the accumulated documentation of 18th century governance fills rooms whose organization reflects the systematic approach required to manage such complex information. Legal codes, economic reports, diplomatic correspondence, and military assessments represent attempts to understand and control social forces that previous Habsburg rulers could manage through personal authority and traditional relationships. Her evening prayers include gratitude for the inheritance of territories whose potential remains largely unrealized, while seeking guidance for decisions that must balance respect for ancestral achievements with recognition that contemporary challenges require innovative responses. The weight of governing domains, where traditional certainties have been questioned by philosophical investigation and practical experience, requires constant attention to competing demands from constituencies whose loyalty can no longer be taken for granted. The palace settles into nighttime routines that reflect the global scope of Habsburg responsibilities. Yet the empire itself has begun to contract under pressure from emerging nation-states, whose legitimacy rests on popular support rather than dynastic inheritance. Guards patrol walls that protect administrative centers, whose authority must compete with alternative forms of political organization that promise greater responsiveness to popular needs and local interests. In workshops throughout the complex, artisans continue projects that serve both traditional ceremonial purposes and practical administrative needs. The machinery of imperial governance continues its operations, yet each day brings evidence that the world is changing in ways that challenge fundamental assumptions about authority, legitimacy, and the relationship between rulers and subjects that have sustained Habsburg power for centuries. The year 1806 dawns grey and cold over Vienna, as Francis II performs his morning ablutions in chambers that have witnessed the steady erosion of Habsburg authority throughout the previous decades. The Holy Roman Empire that his ancestors built through centuries of careful political maneuvering is about to cease its existence, dissolved under pressure from Napoleon's revolutionary armies that have demonstrated the power of nationalist enthusiasm over traditional dynastic loyalty. His morning prayers are conducted in chapels whose artistic treasures commemorate victories that now seem like ancient history, while the religious ceremony itself reflects a Catholic Church that has been forced to accommodate secular ideas about individual conscience and political authority. The chaplains who lead morning services have been educated in seminaries where theological studies must compete with philosophical investigations that question the divine foundation of imperial authority. The emperor's clothing reflects the changing nature of European fashion, yet each garment also represents choices that must balance respect for Habsburg tradition, with acknowledgement that the world has moved beyond the assumptions that once sustained imperial dignity. His breakfast chamber accommodates gatherings that include traditional representatives of Habsburg territories alongside newer advisors, whose expertise reflects the desperate search for strategies that might preserve some form of Habsburg relevance in a transformed political landscape. The morning correspondence brings news of territorial losses that would have been unthinkable to previous generations of Habsburg rulers. French armies occupy territories that have been Habsburg for centuries, while local populations often welcome these invasions as liberation from imperial authority that has become associated with resistance to progressive change. Communications from remaining territorial governors describe social transformations that have made traditional forms of governance increasingly ineffective. Francis reviews these documents while surrounded by advisors whose recommendations reflect the limited options available to a dynasty that has been overtaken by historical forces beyond its control. Military specialists describe defensive strategies that might preserve core Habsburg territories, while diplomatic experts explore possibilities for negotiated settlements that could maintain some form of imperial authority within a European system dominated by revolutionary France. The morning military briefing addresses strategic realities that would have horrified earlier Habsburg emperors. Imperial armies must defend against enemies whose motivation springs from nationalist enthusiasm rather than dynastic ambition, while Habsburg forces increasingly consist of mercenaries and conscripts whose loyalty depends on regular payment rather than traditional feudal obligation. The military technology that once provided Habsburg advantages has been surpassed by innovations developed by revolutionary governments that can mobilize entire populations for warfare. Administrative offices throughout the palace employ clerks whose record-keeping now focuses primarily on managing retreat rather than expansion. Detailed compilations track territorial losses, population movements, and the steady erosion of revenue sources that once funded imperial ambitions. The bureaucratic machinery that once coordinated governance across multiple continents now struggles to maintain authority over territories that previous Habsburg rulers would have considered minor provincial holdings. By afternoon, Francis moves through palace corridors lined with portraits of ancestors whose achievements mock his current circumstances. The Great Hall that once accommodated representatives from territories spanning continents now hosts gatherings whose primary purpose is managing the dissolution of an empire that has lasted longer than most participants can remember. Each conversation addresses practical questions about how to preserve dignity while acknowledging defeat. The evening meal is conducted with protocols that maintain the appearance of imperial authority, while everyone present understands that such ceremonies have become essentially theatrical performances. Wine selections represent the last remnants of cellars that once contained vintages from territories that are now permanently lost to French occupation or local independence movements. Each course served represents resources that might be better devoted to military defense or diplomatic negotiation. Evening correspondence includes communications whose preparation acknowledges that traditional forms of imperial authority have become obsolete. Letters to remaining territorial administrators focus on practical questions about maintaining basic governmental functions rather than grand strategic planning. Diplomatic messages explore possibilities for negotiated settlements that might preserve Habsburg dignity within a European system that has moved beyond dynastic politics toward nationalist organization. Francis retires to chambers where the accumulated documentation of imperial decline fills rooms whose organization reflects the systematic approach required to manage such comprehensive failure. Legal codes that once governed territories from Belgium to southern Italy now apply only to core Austrian holdings, while economic reports describe revenue systems that must be completely reconstructed to accommodate reduced territorial scope and transformed political relationships. His evening prayers include gratitude for the preservation of core Habsburg holdings, while seeking guidance for decisions that must balance family honor with practical recognition that the world has changed in ways that make traditional imperial authority impossible to maintain. The weight of presiding over the end of an institution that has defined European politics for nearly 1,000 years requires spiritual strength that previous Habsburg rulers never needed to develop. The palace settles into nighttime routines that reflect the contracted scope of Habsburg authority, yet the family itself has begun to adapt to circumstances that previous generations could never have imagined. Guards patrol walls that protect administrative centers, whose authority extends only to territories that remain loyal through traditional relationships rather than imperial compulsion. In offices throughout the complex, clerks work through the night, preparing documents whose purposes have shifted from governing an empire to managing the transition toward more modest political arrangements. The machinery of governance continues its operations, yet each day brings evidence that the European world has moved beyond the political forms that sustained Habsburg authority for centuries. The empire that once spanned continents has been reduced to core territories where traditional relationships might still provide foundation for continued Habsburg relevance, while the broader European system develops according to principles that make dynastic authority increasingly anachronistic. Morning light filters through the windows of Schönbrunn Palace in 1848 as Ferdinand awakens to sounds that would have been unthinkable to his ancestors. The distant roar of crowds gathering in Vienna's streets, demanding constitutional government and an end to absolute monarchy. The revolution that has been sweeping across Europe has finally reached the Habsburg heartland, carrying with it ideas about popular sovereignty and individual rights that challenge everything his family has represented for over 6 centuries. His morning routine proceeds with mechanical precision, despite the chaos beyond the palace walls. Servants perform their duties with nervous efficiency, aware that each day might bring fundamental changes to the social order that has defined their existence. The breakfast chamber accommodates gatherings where traditional court protocols compete with urgent discussions about how to respond to popular demands that previous Habsburg rulers never needed to consider. The morning correspondence brings reports from territories throughout the empire where nationalist movements have gained strength that threatens to tear apart the multi-ethnic structure that has been the foundation of Habsburg power. Hungarian revolutionaries demand independence, while Czech and Italian populations organize resistance to imperial authority. Each communication describes situations that require immediate response, yet the traditional tools of Habsburg governance seem inadequate to address challenges that spring from popular enthusiasm rather than aristocratic ambition. Ferdinand reviews these documents while surrounded by advisors whose recommendations reflect the desperate search for strategies that might preserve Habsburg authority in a world that has moved beyond acceptance of hereditary rule. Conservative ministers advocate military suppression of revolutionary movements, while moderate voices suggest constitutional reforms that might satisfy popular demands without completely destroying traditional authority structures. The morning military briefing addresses strategic challenges that previous Habsburg rulers never faced. How to deploy imperial armies against populations that include Habsburg subjects demanding rights that have been denied for generations. Military commanders trained in traditional warfare find themselves confronting enemies whose weapons include newspapers, public speeches, and organized demonstrations that can mobilize entire populations against imperial authority. Administrative offices throughout the palace struggle to maintain basic governmental functions while revolutionary pressure threatens to overwhelm institutional capacity. Clerks whose training emphasized careful documentation and systematic procedures find themselves managing crisis situations that change faster than bureaucratic responses can be formulated. The machinery of imperial governance, refined through centuries of gradual development, proves inadequate for addressing revolutionary challenges that demand immediate adaptation. By afternoon, Ferdinand moves through palace corridors where the sounds of street demonstrations penetrate even the most insulated chambers. The Great Hall that once accommodated representatives from territories across the empire now hosts emergency sessions, where participants debate whether Habsburg authority can survive in any recognizable form. Each conversation acknowledges that the political world has fundamentally changed, yet no one can predict what forms of governance might emerge from the revolutionary chaos. Evening meals are conducted with protocols that maintain the appearance of normal court life, while everyone present understands that such ceremonies might soon become impossible to sustain. Wine selections represent the remnants of imperial cellars, whose contents might be distributed among revolutionary crowds if political settlements cannot be negotiated. Each course served represents resources that could be redirected toward military defense or political negotiation. Evening correspondence includes communications whose preparation acknowledges that traditional imperial authority has been challenged by forces that previous Habsburg rulers never needed to confront. Letters to territorial administrators focus on immediate crisis management rather than long-term strategic planning, while diplomatic messages explore possibilities for constitutional arrangements that might preserve some form of Habsburg relevance within a transformed European political system. Ferdinand retires to chambers where the accumulated documentation of revolutionary challenge fills rooms whose organization reflects the systematic approach required to understand popular movements that threaten institutional survival. Legal codes that once provided foundation for absolute monarchy must be reconsidered in light of constitutional demands, while economic reports describe revenue systems that have been disrupted by revolutionary activity throughout Habsburg territories. His evening prayers include desperate appeals for divine guidance in managing challenges that test the survival capacity of institutions that have endured for centuries. The weight of potentially presiding over the complete transformation or destruction of Habsburg authority requires spiritual resources that previous rulers developed for expansion rather than preservation during existential crisis. The palace settles into nighttime routines that reflect uncertainty about whether traditional forms of governance will survive the revolutionary pressures that continue to build throughout Habsburg territories. Guards patrol walls that protect administrative centres, whose authority faces challenges from populations that have learned to organise effective resistance to imperial control. In offices throughout the complex, clerks work through the night preparing documents whose purposes have shifted from routine administration to crisis management and potential institutional reconstruction. The machinery of Habsburg governance continues its operations. Yet each hour brings evidence that European political development has moved beyond the forms that sustained dynastic authority for over 6 centuries. The empire that once dominated continental European politics must now adapt to circumstances where popular sovereignty has become the foundation for political legitimacy, while traditional concepts of hereditary authority struggle for relevance in a transformed world. D-World. The morning light of December 1916 struggles through the frost-covered windows of the Hofburg Palace as Emperor Franz Joseph awakens for what will be his final time. At 86 years old, his body moves with the careful deliberation of a man who has witnessed the transformation of an entire world. The empire he inherited as a young man of 18 has endured wars that redefined the very concept of conflict, while technologies that his ancestors could never have imagined have revolutionized everything from communication to warfare. His personal valet, a man who has served the imperial household for over 4 decades, assists with the morning ablutions that have become increasingly difficult for the aging emperor. The water in the silver basin steams in the cold December air, while the simple soap used for his daily washing represents a deliberate choice to maintain connection with modest personal habits that have characterized his entire reign. Despite governing an empire spanning multiple ethnic groups and languages, Franz Joseph has always insisted on maintaining the austere personal standards that his military training instilled in him as a young prince. The clothing selected for this morning reflects both imperial dignity and practical simplicity. His military uniform, tailored according to specifications that have remained unchanged for decades, incorporates decorations earned through 6 decades of service to an empire that has faced constant challenges to its survival. The fabric itself comes from mills in territories where Habsburg authority now competes with nationalist movements that demand independence from imperial control. His breakfast chamber accommodates the reduced court that reflects both wartime austerity and the emperor's advancing age. The morning meal consists of simple fare that would have seemed modest to his predecessors, yet each item represents supply chains that have been strained by the massive military conflict consuming European resources. Coffee arrives from sources that have become increasingly difficult to access as enemy naval forces disrupt traditional trade routes, while bread is made from flour, whose quality has declined due to agricultural demands created by total war. The morning correspondence brings reports from military commanders whose communications describe battles fought with weapons that have revolutionized warfare beyond recognition. Machine guns capable of devastating infantry charges in minutes have made traditional cavalry tactics obsolete, while artillery pieces whose range and destructive power exceed anything previous generations could imagine have turned entire landscapes into moon-like craters. The casualty figures reported in daily briefings represent losses that would have seemed impossible to earlier Habsburg rulers. Franz Joseph reviews these documents while surrounded by advisors whose expertise reflects the desperate search for strategies that might preserve Habsburg authority in a conflict that has already consumed millions of lives. Military specialists describe defensive positions that must be held against enemies whose industrial capacity has enabled unprecedented levels of sustained combat, while diplomatic experts explore possibilities for negotiated settlements that might end a war whose continuation threatens the survival of the empire itself. The morning military briefing addresses strategic realities that have transformed the nature of imperial governance. Armies numbering in the millions require supply systems that strain the economic capacity of territories whose populations have been mobilized for total war. Railroad networks that once facilitated peaceful commerce now serve primarily military purposes, while industrial production has been redirected toward weapons manufacturing that consumes resources previously devoted to civilian needs. Administrative offices throughout the palace employ staffs whose composition reflects the demographic changes created by military conscription. Women and elderly men perform duties that were once exclusively male responsibilities, while the systematic documentation that has characterized Habsburg governance must accommodate the accelerated pace of wartime decision-making. The bureaucratic machinery that once managed peaceful territorial administration now focuses primarily on coordinating military logistics and maintaining civilian morale. By midday, Franz Joseph moves through palace corridors whose emptiness reflects the reduced ceremonial activity that wartime conditions have imposed on court life. Portraits of ancestors who governed during peaceful periods seem to observe current circumstances with expressions that might be interpreted as either approval or reproach. The Great Hall that once accommodated elaborate social gatherings now hosts briefings where participants discuss casualty reports and resource allocation rather than cultural events or diplomatic receptions. His afternoon audiences bring visitors whose concerns reflect the total mobilization that modern warfare has imposed on Habsburg society. Industrial managers describe production challenges that require governmental intervention to maintain output levels necessary for military success. Agricultural specialists report on food distribution systems that must balance military requirements with civilian needs while dealing with labor shortages created by mass conscription. Medical administrators present statistics about hospital capacity and treatment techniques that have been developed in response to wounds inflicted by modern weapons. The scale of casualties and the severity of injuries have forced medical innovation at unprecedented speed, while the psychological trauma experienced by soldiers exposed to industrial warfare has created entirely new categories of treatment requirements that previous medical knowledge never addressed. The afternoon inspection of palace facilities reveals adaptations that reflect wartime priorities throughout the imperial administration. Workshops that once produced luxury goods for court use now manufacture items needed for military supply, while storage areas have been converted to accommodate medical supplies and emergency food reserves. The transformation of peacetime facilities for wartime purposes demonstrates the comprehensive nature of the mobilization that total war has imposed on Habsburg society. Communication networks that once carried routine administrative correspondence now focus primarily on military coordination and intelligence gathering. Telegraph systems operate continuously to maintain contact with military commanders whose positions change daily according to battlefield developments, while encrypted messages carry information whose secrecy could determine the survival of entire army groups engaged in combat across multiple fronts simultaneously. As evening approaches, the Great Hall accommodates gatherings whose reduced scale reflects both wartime austerity and the emperor's declining health. The evening meal is conducted with protocols that maintain imperial dignity while acknowledging resource limitations that have affected even palace food supplies. Wine selections represent the remnants of cellars whose contents have been rationed according to wartime necessity rather than ceremonial tradition. The evening's limited entertainment includes musical performances that reflect the somber mood created by years of devastating warfare. Compositions performed by reduced orchestras emphasize themes of sacrifice and endurance, rather than the celebration and abundance that characterized earlier court cultural activities. The musicians themselves often represent families whose male members have been lost to military service, their performances carrying emotional weight that transcends mere artistic expression. Evening correspondence includes communications whose urgency reflects the accelerating crisis facing Habsburg authority. Reports from military commanders describe defensive positions that may be impossible to maintain without reinforcements that are no longer available, while messages from territorial administrators document civilian morale problems that threaten to undermine support for continued military effort. Each communication represents decisions that could determine whether the empire will survive the current conflict. Diplomatic messages explore possibilities for peace negotiations that might preserve some form of Habsburg authority, yet the territorial concessions that enemy powers demand would effectively dismember the multi-ethnic empire that has been the foundation of Habsburg identity for centuries. The choice between continued warfare that might result in complete military defeat and negotiated peace that would require fundamental transformation of imperial structure represents an impossible dilemma for a ruler whose entire life has been devoted to preserving Habsburg heritage. Franz Joseph retires to chambers where the accumulated documentation of wartime governance fills rooms whose organization reflects the systematic approach required to manage total mobilization. Military reports, industrial production statistics, casualty compilations, and diplomatic correspondence represent attempts to coordinate resources and strategies for a conflict whose scale exceeds the capacity of traditional governmental institutions to manage effectively. His evening prayers include desperate appeals for divine intervention in a conflict that has exceeded human capacity to control or resolve through conventional means. The weight of governing during a war that threatens not only Habsburg survival, but the entire European political system requires spiritual strength that must sustain hope despite overwhelming evidence that the world his ancestors built is disintegrating beyond recognition or reconstruction. The palace settles into nighttime routines that reflect uncertainty about whether Habsburg authority will survive the military and political pressures that continue to intensify throughout the empire. Guards patrol walls that protect administrative centers whose authority faces challenges from military collapse, civilian exhaustion, and nationalist movements that have gained strength through wartime suffering and political disillusion. In offices throughout the complex, clerks work through the night preparing documents whose purposes have shifted from routine administration to crisis management and potential succession planning. The machinery of Habsburg governance continues its operations, yet each hour brings evidence that European political development has moved beyond the forms that sustained dynastic authority for over 6 centuries. The empire that once dominated continental European politics must now confront the possibility that its dissolution has become inevitable, regardless of military outcomes or diplomatic negotiations. The winter morning of November 11th, 1918, brings news that will end over 600 years of Habsburg imperial authority. In chambers that have witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, Emperor Charles awakens to reports that armistice negotiations have concluded with terms that will dismember the empire into separate national states. The Austria-Hungary that his ancestors built through centuries of careful political maneuvering will cease to exist within days, replaced by independent nations whose legitimacy rests on ethnic identity rather than dynastic inheritance. His morning routine proceeds with mechanical precision despite the revolutionary changes occurring throughout his former territories. Servants perform their duties with the knowledge that their positions will soon become obsolete as the imperial household contracts to accommodate dramatically reduced circumstances. The breakfast chamber hosts final gatherings where traditional court protocols compete with practical discussions about how to manage the transition from imperial authority to private citizenship. The morning correspondence brings reports of territorial succession that would have been unthinkable to previous Habsburg rulers. Hungarian leaders declare independence while establishing their own governmental institutions. Czech politicians proclaim the creation of Czechoslovakia, with borders that include traditional Habsburg territories, and Yugoslav representatives announce the formation of a southern Slavic state that incorporates Habsburg lands from Croatia to Slovenia. Each communication describes the peaceful transfer of authority from imperial administration to nationalist governments. Charles reviews these documents while surrounded by advisors whose recommendations focus on practical questions about personal safety and family welfare rather than strategies for preserving Habsburg authority. Legal specialists explore possibilities for negotiated settlements that might protect imperial family assets, while diplomatic experts assess international opinion about providing sanctuary for displaced Habsburg royalty. The transformation from governing millions of subjects to managing personal exile represents a psychological adjustment that previous Habsburg rulers never needed to consider. The morning military briefing addresses the final dissolution of imperial armed forces that once defended territories from the Netherlands to southern Italy. Soldiers whose loyalty had been pledged to Habsburg authority now transfer their allegiance to new national armies, while military equipment and installations are divided among successor states according to armistice agreements. The systematic dismantling of military institutions that took centuries to develop occurs within days through administrative procedures that treat imperial authority as a historical anachronism. Administrative offices throughout the palace manage the complex process of transferring governmental records and resources to successor states whose administrative capacity must be established quickly to maintain basic public services. Clerks whose careers have been devoted to Habsburg service now prepare final reports that will serve as historical documentation of an empire whose existence is ending. The bureaucratic machinery that once coordinated governance across multiple continents now focuses exclusively on organizing its own dissolution. By afternoon, Charles moves through palace corridors that are being systematically emptied of artistic treasures and governmental materials. Portraits of ancestors who governed successfully for generations now serve as reminders of dynastic achievements that have become historically irrelevant rather than sources of continuing authority. The Great Hall that once accommodated representatives from territories throughout the empire now hosts final ceremonies where participants bid farewell to an institution that has defined their professional and personal identities. Evening meals are conducted with protocols that maintain dignity while acknowledging that such ceremonies represent the conclusion of traditions that have evolved over centuries of imperial development. Wine selections represent the final consumption of cellars whose contents will be distributed among creditors or transferred to museums, where they will serve as historical artifacts rather than symbols of continuing imperial authority. Each course served represents the end of supply chains that once connected Habsburg territories across continents. The evening's final entertainment includes musical performances that commemorate the cultural achievements enabled by centuries of Habsburg patronage. Compositions performed by court musicians emphasize themes of conclusion and transformation, rather than continuation and stability. The musicians themselves face uncertain futures, as the institutions that have supported their artistic development cease to exist within the transformed political landscape. Evening correspondence includes final communications, whose preparation acknowledges the complete end of Habsburg imperial authority. Letters to former territorial administrators focus on practical questions about transferring governmental responsibilities to successor states, while personal messages explore possibilities for maintaining family relationships, despite the geographical dispersion that exile will impose. Each document represents the conclusion of administrative relationships that have sustained imperial governance for generations. Charles retires to chambers where the accumulated documentation of dynastic history fills rooms whose contents will soon be transferred to archives where they will serve scholarly rather than governmental purposes. Legal codes that once governed territories from Belgium to Romania now represent historical curiosities, while diplomatic correspondence that once influenced European politics becomes source material for academic research rather than foundation for continuing political relationships. His final prayers as emperor include gratitude for the preservation of family safety during the transition from imperial authority to private citizenship, while seeking guidance for personal decisions that must balance respect for ancestral heritage with adaptation to circumstances that previous Habsburg rulers never needed to contemplate. The weight of presiding over the end of an institution that has defined European politics for over 6 centuries requires spiritual strength that must sustain hope for personal meaning despite the complete transformation of political identity. The palace settles into its final night as the center of Habsburg imperial authority. Guards patrol walls that will soon protect historical monuments rather than active governmental institutions, while clerks work through the night preparing final documents that will conclude administrative relationships lasting for centuries. The machinery of Habsburg governance completes its final operations as European political development moves definitively beyond the dynastic forms that sustained imperial authority since the medieval period. In workshops throughout the complex, artisans complete final projects that will serve as historical artifacts rather than ceremonial implements of continuing imperial power. The empire that once spanned continents and influenced global politics has been reduced to personal memories and historical documentation, while the European world develops according to principles of national sovereignty that make dynastic authority permanently obsolete. The sun sets on Habsburg imperial authority for the final time, ending a political tradition that had endured longer than most participants could remember, yet which has been swept away by historical forces that prove stronger than centuries of accumulated power and prestige. Tig. The cold mountain air of exile carries different sounds than the ceremonial halls that once echoed with imperial authority. In the modest villa overlooking Lake Geneva, Charles awakens on a February morning in 1922 to the simple chimes of a local church bell, rather than the elaborate fanfare that once announced each dawn of his reign. His personal valet, one of the few servants who followed the family into exile, assists with morning ablutions that have been reduced to essential simplicity. The silver basin that holds his washwater is one of the last remnants of imperial luxury. Its ornate engravings are stark contrast to the humble cottage that now serves as home. The clothing selected for this morning reflects the dramatic transformation from emperor to private gentleman. Gone are the elaborate military uniforms with their golden braids and ceremonial decorations. Instead, Charles dons a simple woolen suit of Swiss manufacture, its practical cut designed for comfort rather than imperial dignity. The fabric speaks to local craftsmanship rather than the exotic materials that once arrived from territories spanning continents. His morning routine proceeds with quiet efficiency, each movement reflecting adaptation to circumstances that require personal involvement in tasks once performed by armies of servants. The breakfast chamber is now a modest dining room where family meals are prepared by a single cook, whose repertoire must accommodate reduced budgets and limited ingredient availability. The morning meal consists of local bread, cheese from nearby alpine farms, and coffee, whose quality reflects regional preferences rather than imperial procurement from global sources. The conversations conducted over breakfast focus on practical household matters and the education of his children, rather than reports from territorial governors or military commanders. Letters arrive sporadically, carried by postal services that treat the former emperor as any other private citizen. Correspondence from fellow exiles describes similar adjustments to dramatically reduced circumstances, while messages from former subjects express loyalty that can no longer be translated into political authority. Each communication reminds Charles of relationships that once defined imperial governance, but now exist only as personal memories and historical documentation. The morning walk through village streets provides encounters with local residents who treat their distinguished neighbour with respectful curiosity rather than imperial deference. Shopkeepers offer goods at fair prices without the elaborate protocols that once governed any interaction with Habsburg authority. Children playing in village squares regard the former emperor as simply another elderly gentleman whose presence has become part of their familiar landscape. By midday, Charles retreats to a modest study where he attempts to make sense of the historical forces that transformed his world beyond recognition. Books borrowed from the local library provide perspectives on political developments that once would have required consultation with the empire's finest scholars. Maps, spread across a simple wooden desk, show the new national boundaries that have replaced Habsburg territories, each line representing ethnic identities that proved stronger than dynastic loyalty. His afternoon correspondence includes letters to family members scattered across Europe, each finding their own paths through the transformed political landscape. Former archdukes work in banks and insurance companies, while imperial princesses marry into foreign nobility or pursue professional careers that would have been unthinkable during the days of empire. Each family update describes adaptations that demonstrate resilience, while acknowledging that the world has moved permanently beyond the assumptions that once sustained Habsburg authority. The village doctor, who attends to family medical needs, treats his distinguished patients with professional competence, unmarked by the elaborate ceremonies that once surrounded imperial healthcare. Prescriptions are filled at the local pharmacy, where Habsburg names appear on customer ledgers alongside those of farmers, merchants, and artisans. The democratization of daily life extends to every aspect of existence, from medical care to grocery shopping. Evening meals are conducted around a simple wooden table, where family members serve themselves from dishes prepared in a modest kitchen. The wine, when available, comes from local vineyards, whose modest vintages cannot compare to the cellars that once contained selections from territories across the empire. Conversations focus on immediate family concerns and local community events rather than international politics or dynastic strategy. The evening entertainment consists of reading books by lamplight or listening to radio broadcasts that bring news of a world where Habsburg concerns have become historically irrelevant. Musical performances are limited to family members playing simple instruments around the fireplace, their repertoires consisting of folk songs learned from local sources rather than elaborate compositions once performed by court orchestras. Charles retires to a bedroom whose furnishings reflect local craftsmanship rather than imperial luxury. The wooden bed frame was made by village carpenters using techniques passed down through generations of Swiss woodworkers. The quilts that provide warmth during alpine winters were sewn by local women whose skills served practical rather than ceremonial purposes. The simplicity of his sleeping arrangements contrasts dramatically with the elaborate chambers that once accommodated imperial rest. His evening prayers include gratitude for family safety and health, while seeking guidance for personal decisions that must be made without the advisory systems that once supported imperial authority. The spiritual resources that once sustained governance over millions of subjects now focus on managing the psychological adjustments required for private citizenship. The weight of personal responsibility has replaced the burden of imperial authority, yet both require wisdom that draws from sources beyond human understanding. The cottage settles into nighttime quiet that reflects the peaceful rhythms of village life rather than the complex protocols that once governed imperial households. No guards patrol outside walls, no secretaries work through the night preparing official documents, no urgent communications arrive requiring immediate imperial response. The machinery of government that once operated continuously has been replaced by the simple routines of family life in a small alpine community. Through the bedroom window, Charles can see lights from village homes where families follow their own evening routines. Children complete homework assignments that will prepare them for careers in a democratic world, while their parents discuss local concerns that affect their immediate community rather than international politics. The universal rhythms of domestic life continue regardless of the political transformations that have reshaped European civilization. In neighboring cottages, former Habsburg officials pursue modest careers that utilize their administrative experience in reduced circumstances. A former imperial treasurer now keeps books for local businesses, while a former diplomatic secretary teaches languages at the village school. Their professional skills have been adapted to serve local needs rather than imperial ambitions, yet their expertise continues to contribute to community welfare in ways that demonstrate the transferability of administrative competence. The village priest who conducts Sunday services treats his distinguished parishioner as one member among many of a congregation whose spiritual needs transcend political identity. Sermons focus on universal themes of faith and community rather than the elaborate theological justifications that once supported dynastic authority. The democratization of religious experience parallels the broader transformation of social relationships that has accompanied the transition from empire to republic. Morning light reveals a landscape where former Habsburg territories have been absorbed into new national identities that reflect ethnic and linguistic communities rather than dynastic inheritance. Village newspapers carry reports about political developments in countries that once comprised the empire, their independent governments pursuing policies that serve local interests rather than imperial coordination. The fragmentation of Habsburg authority has been replaced by the multiplication of democratic institutions that respond to popular will rather than hereditary tradition. The postal service delivers letters from former subjects who have adapted successfully to citizenship in the new national states. Czech farmers report improved agricultural conditions under democratic government, while Hungarian merchants describe expanded business opportunities enabled by independence from imperial regulation. Each communication provides evidence that the dissolution of Habsburg authority has not prevented the development of prosperous and stable communities throughout former imperial territories. Charles spends increasing amounts of time walking through alpine meadows, where the seasonal cycles of agriculture continue regardless of political transformation. Farmers whose families have worked the same land for generations pursue traditional methods that have sustained rural communities through centuries of political change. The permanence of agricultural rhythms provides perspective on the temporary nature of political institutions, while the continuity of rural life demonstrates human capacity for adaptation and survival. Local merchants who supply household necessities treat their distinguished customer with friendly respect that reflects Swiss democratic traditions rather than imperial deference. Transactions are conducted according to market principles that apply equally to all customers, regardless of their historical background. The equalization of commercial relationships demonstrates the practical implementation of democratic values that have replaced hierarchical social structures throughout European society. The village library contains books that provide historical perspective on the Habsburg dynasty, their pages offering scholarly analysis rather than official justification for imperial authority. Reading about his own family's history from external sources provides Charles with insights into the long-term patterns that shape dynastic development and eventual dissolution. The objectivity of historical scholarship replaces the partisan narratives that once supported imperial legitimacy. Evening conversations with neighbours reveal the practical concerns that occupy ordinary citizens whose lives continue regardless of political transformation. Local farmers discuss crop rotation and livestock management, while village artisans share techniques for improving their crafts. These exchanges demonstrate that human communities possess internal resources for organisation and development that do not require imperial coordination or dynastic leadership. As autumn settles over the Alpine village, Charles observes the seasonal preparations that have sustained rural communities through countless political changes. Farmers harvest crops using methods perfected through generations of experience, while households preserve food for winter storage, according to techniques that predate any particular form of government. The continuity of rural traditions provides evidence that human civilization possesses foundations that transcend the political institutions that rise and fall with historical change. The village school, where local children receive their education, emphasizes practical skills and democratic values, rather than the classical learning that once prepared aristocratic youth for imperial service. Students learn mathematics and science that will serve them in careers within democratic societies, while their history lessons emphasize popular movements and national development rather than dynastic achievement. The transformation of educational priorities reflects broader social changes that have redefined the relationship between individual development and community welfare. Winter's arrival brings community activities that unite village residents, regardless of their social backgrounds. Collective efforts to maintain roads and public facilities demonstrate the voluntary cooperation that sustains democratic communities, while seasonal celebrations reflect local traditions that have evolved independently of imperial influence. The strength of community bonds reveals that human society possesses organizational capacities that do not require hierarchical authority to function effectively. Charles continues his daily routines within a community that has provided refuge while demonstrating the vitality of democratic institutions. His personal adaptation to private citizenship parallels the broader European transformation from imperial authority to popular sovereignty, while his family's integration into local community life illustrates the human capacity for adjustment to dramatically changed circumstances. The former emperor, who once governed territories spanning continents, has discovered that meaningful existence can be sustained within the modest boundaries of a single alpine village, where democratic values provide foundation for both individual dignity and collective welfare. The spring of 1922 brings news that the last remnants of Habsburg institutional authority have been formally dissolved through legal processes that treat dynastic claims as historical curiosities rather than legitimate political foundations. Administrative procedures that once required imperial approval are now managed by democratic institutions whose authority derives from popular consent rather than hereditary tradition. The complete transition from empire to republic has been accomplished through systematic legal reforms that demonstrate the practical possibility of replacing aristocratic government with democratic alternatives. The village clockmaker's workshop becomes Charles's refuge during the long afternoons of exile, where he learns the intricate mechanics of timepieces with the same methodical attention he once applied to imperial administration. His fingers, once accustomed to signing documents that governed millions, now carefully manipulate tiny gears and springs under the patient guidance of Herr Meller, a craftsman whose family has measured time for Alpine communities across 3 generations. The precision required for clockwork repair provides meditative focus that helps Charles process the magnitude of his transformed circumstances while contributing useful skills to his adopted community. The delicate brass mechanisms spread across the workbench represent individual universes of mechanical complexity, each component serving essential functions within systems that operate according to physical laws rather than political authority. Springs must be wound to exact tensions, escapements calibrated to precise tolerances, and pendulums balanced to achieve the rhythmic accuracy that allows communities to coordinate their daily activities. The satisfaction of restoring broken timepieces to functional operation provides tangible evidence of constructive achievement in a life that must now measure success through personal contribution rather than imperial command. His apprenticeship progresses through stages that mirror the methodical development of any skilled craft, beginning with simple cleaning and maintenance tasks before advancing to more complex repairs and adjustments. Herr Müller's instruction emphasizes patient observation and careful practice rather than theoretical knowledge. His teaching methods refined through decades of training young craftsmen whose livelihoods depend on practical competence. The democratic nature of skill acquisition, where ability matters more than background, provides daily reinforcement of the values that have replaced aristocratic privilege throughout European society. The workshop's customers represent the full spectrum of village social life, from prosperous farmers whose pocket watches mark agricultural schedules to modest clerks whose mantle clocks coordinate family routines. Each timepiece carries personal significance that reflects individual stories of work, family, and community participation. Repairing these instruments provides Charles with intimate glimpses into the daily concerns and seasonal rhythms that shape ordinary lives, revealing the human foundations that sustain democratic communities, regardless of their political leadership. Local farmers arrive with pocket watches, inherited from fathers and grandfathers, their cases worn smooth by generations of handling during daily agricultural work. These timepieces measure not just hours and minutes, but the seasonal cycles that govern planting and harvest, the market schedules that determine when crops should be transported to urban buyers, and the family traditions that connect contemporary practices to ancestral wisdom. Their repair requires understanding of both mechanical principles and cultural significance that extends far beyond technical competence. Village merchants bring elaborate mantle clocks, whose ornate cases reflect prosperity, achieved through careful attention to customer service and competitive pricing. These timepieces coordinate business operations that depend on precise scheduling of deliveries, appointments, and seasonal sales cycles. Their complex chiming mechanisms must be adjusted to provide reliable time signals that enable commercial coordination throughout the community, while their decorative elements require restoration techniques that combine mechanical skill with artistic sensitivity. School teachers carry simple but reliable watches that coordinate educational schedules designed to prepare children for citizenship in democratic societies, where punctuality and personal responsibility are essential virtues. These timepieces measure not just class periods and recess breaks, but the progressive development of young minds whose education will determine their community's future prosperity and stability. Their maintenance requires appreciation for the social functions that accurate timekeeping serves in institutions dedicated to human development rather than elite privilege. The seasonal rhythm of repair work reflects the agricultural cycles that continue to influence village life despite increasing industrial development throughout European society. Spring brings timepieces that have been damaged by winter moisture, their mechanisms requiring careful cleaning and lubrication to restore proper function for the busy growing season ahead. Summer repairs focus on instruments that have been stressed by heat and humidity during the most intensive period of agricultural activity, while autumn brings preparation work designed to ensure reliable operation throughout the challenging winter months. Charles develops particular expertise in restoring antique timepieces whose mechanisms reflect earlier periods of clockmaking innovation. Their hand-forged components requiring techniques that combine traditional craftsmanship with contemporary understanding of mechanical principles. These historical instruments connect contemporary village life to generations of ancestors whose daily routines were measured by similar devices, their continuing operation serving as tangible links between past and present that transcend political transformation. His reputation for careful workmanship spreads throughout the surrounding countryside, bringing customers who travel considerable distances to consult the former emperor, whose new identity has been reconstructed around practical skill rather than hereditary authority. Shepherds from mountain valleys arrive with pocket watches that coordinate seasonal migrations between lowland winter quarters and highland summer pastures. Their timepieces must function reliably despite exposure to extreme weather conditions and rough handling during long journeys across difficult terrain. Village priests bring church clocks whose public timekeeping functions serve entire communities by coordinating worship services, market days, and civic meetings that are essential to democratic participation. These large mechanisms require understanding of weights and pendulums, whose operation must remain accurate despite temperature fluctuations and seasonal changes that affect the stone towers housing their movements. Their maintenance involves collaboration with church committees whose democratic decision-making processes determine repair priorities and funding sources. Local doctors carry pocket watches that coordinate medical appointments and emergency responses within communities where healthcare access depends on careful scheduling and efficient resource allocation. These precision timepieces must maintain accuracy during house calls that require travel across varied terrain and weather conditions, while their reliability can literally mean the difference between life and death during medical emergencies that demand immediate response. The technical knowledge Charles acquires through clockmaking apprenticeship provides intellectual stimulation that replaces the complex analytical challenges that once characterized imperial administration. Understanding gear ratios, spring tensions, and pendulum mathematics requires the same systematic thinking that once addressed territorial governance and diplomatic negotiation, while the precision demanded by mechanical adjustment offers satisfaction comparable to successful policy implementation. The transferability of cognitive skills demonstrates that human intelligence can find meaningful expression within any occupation that demands careful analysis and systematic problem-solving. Evening conversations with Herr Müller reveal the philosophical dimensions of craftwork that connect individual skill development to broader community welfare. Accurate timekeeping enables social coordination that is essential for democratic institutions, while the tradition of passing mechanical knowledge between generations preserves cultural continuity that transcends political change. The clockmaker's role in maintaining community infrastructure demonstrates how specialized skills contribute to collective prosperity when guided by values that emphasize service rather than privilege. The workshop's library contains technical manuals whose mathematical precision rivals the complexity of any governmental administration. Their pages describing mechanical relationships that operate according to natural laws rather than human authority. Studying these texts provides Charles with insights into universal principles that govern both mechanical systems and social organization, while their emphasis on empirical observation and experimental verification reflects scientific methods that have revolutionized human understanding of natural processes. Seasonal apprentice gatherings bring young craftsmen whose training represents democratic approaches to skill transmission that emphasize merit over birth circumstances. These students arrive from diverse social backgrounds, their advancement determined by demonstrated ability rather than family connections or aristocratic sponsorship. Their enthusiasm for learning practical skills that will enable independent livelihoods provides daily evidence of human potential that flourishes when opportunity is distributed according to democratic rather than hereditary principles. The precision instruments used in clockmaking reflect industrial innovations that have transformed European manufacturing during Charles's lifetime, their accuracy enabling measurement capabilities that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. Micrometers and calipers allow mechanical tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters, while specialized tools designed for specific repair tasks demonstrate the sophistication that human ingenuity can achieve when applied to practical problems requiring systematic solutions. Local metalworking shops provide materials and services that support the clockmaking trade, while demonstrating the interdependent relationships that sustain democratic communities through voluntary cooperation rather than hierarchical command. Brass foundries produce custom gears according to specifications that demand mathematical precision, while spring manufacturers create components whose metallurgical properties must be calibrated to exact requirements. These commercial relationships operate through market mechanisms that reward quality and reliability rather than political influence. The village's integration into regional economic networks reveals how democratic institutions enable prosperity through voluntary exchange rather than imperial extraction. Raw materials arrive from specialized suppliers whose businesses serve customers throughout the Alpine region, while finished timepieces find markets in urban centers where accurate timekeeping serves industrial and commercial functions that require precise coordination. The success of these trade relationships depends on reputation and competitive performance rather than political privilege or territorial control. Charles's personal transformation from emperor to craftsman parallels the broader European evolution from aristocratic to democratic social organization, while his integration into village community life demonstrates the human capacity for adaptation to dramatically changed circumstances. His daily work contributes tangible value to neighbors whose acceptance reflects democratic values rather than deference to inherited authority, while his developing expertise provides personal satisfaction that derives from useful achievement rather than ceremonial recognition. Winter evenings in the workshop provide opportunities for complex restoration projects that require extended concentration and sophisticated technical knowledge. Antique timepieces, whose mechanisms represent centuries of clockmaking evolution, arrive from collectors and museums whose preservation efforts maintain connections to technological traditions that preceded current industrial capabilities. These historical instruments require understanding of hand-forging techniques and assembly methods that have been largely replaced by modern manufacturing, while their cultural significance extends far beyond their mechanical functions. The village's clockmaking tradition connects contemporary residents to generations of ancestors whose daily routines were coordinated by similar mechanisms, their continuing operation serving as tangible evidence of human ingenuity that transcends political transformation. Church bells cast during medieval periods continue to mark time for communities whose social organization has evolved beyond recognition, while family timepieces inherited across generations maintain personal connections to ancestral wisdom that remains relevant despite changing circumstances. Charles's correspondence with fellow exiles reveals similar patterns of adaptation and personal reconstruction throughout European communities, where former aristocrats have discovered meaningful existence through practical contribution rather than inherited privilege. Former archdukes work as engineers and teachers, while imperial princesses pursue medical and educational careers that serve democratic societies rather than aristocratic courts. Their collective experience demonstrates that human dignity can be sustained through useful work regardless of political circumstances. The approaching spring of 1922 brings news that the final legal remnants of Habsburg authority have been dissolved through democratic processes that treat dynastic claims as historical curiosities rather than legitimate political foundations. Administrative procedures that once required imperial approval are now managed by elected officials whose authority derives from popular consent rather than hereditary tradition, while territorial boundaries reflect ethnic and linguistic communities rather than dynastic inheritance. The complete transition from empire to republic has been accomplished through systematic institutional reforms that demonstrate the practical possibility of replacing aristocratic government with democratic alternatives. Village preparations for the growing season reveal the agricultural foundations that sustain human communities regardless of their political organization, while seasonal celebrations reflect cultural traditions that have evolved independently of imperial influence. The strength of local institutions demonstrates that democratic societies possess organizational capacities adequate for maintaining prosperity and stability without hierarchical authority, while the voluntary cooperation that characterizes community projects reveals human potential for collective achievement through mutual respect, rather than compulsory obedience. The Clockmaker's Workshop continues its daily operations within a community that measures time according to natural rhythms and human needs rather than imperial ceremony, while the precision instruments that coordinate village life serve practical purposes that connect individual efforts to collective welfare. Charles's transformation from emperor to craftsman reflects the broader European evolution towards societies where authority derives from competence and consent, rather than inheritance and tradition, while his personal adaptation to democratic citizenship demonstrates the human capacity for meaningful existence within any social organization that respects individual dignity and provides opportunities for constructive contribution. The morning bells of Madeira echo across the harbour as Charles awakens on April 1st, 1922, in the modest villa that has become his final refuge. The Atlantic breeze carries salt air through windows that frame a view of fishing boats returning with their dawn catch, their simple purpose a stark contrast to the imperial fleets that once carried Habsburg authority across distant seas. His breathing has grown laboured during the night, each inhalation a conscious effort that reminds him of mortality in ways that imperial physicians once carefully concealed behind elaborate medical ceremonies. His personal attendant, Father Weber, assists with morning ablutions that have been simplified by both reduced circumstances and declining health. The basin of warm water steams gently in the subtropical morning air, while the simple soap reflects local Portuguese manufacture rather than exotic imports from territories that once acknowledged Habsburg sovereignty. Charles moves slowly but deliberately, each gesture reflecting adaptation to physical limitations that have accompanied his exile to this remote Atlantic island. The breakfast chamber overlooks gardens where banana trees and exotic flowers create a landscape that would have seemed fantastical to his alpine ancestors. Local servants prepare meals using ingredients that reflect Portuguese colonial connections to Africa and South America, their preparations incorporating spices and cooking techniques unknown to traditional Habsburg court cuisine. The morning meal consists of fresh fruit harvested from nearby plantations, bread made from grain imported through trading networks that operate independently of European imperial systems. Letters arrive by steamship from family members scattered throughout Europe, their contents describing continued adaptation to democratic societies where former aristocrats pursue careers based on personal competence rather than inherited privilege. His wife Zita writes from Switzerland about their children's education in schools where democratic values shape curriculum designed to prepare students for citizenship rather than court service. Each communication reinforces the reality that the world has moved permanently beyond the assumptions that once sustained dynastic authority. The morning walk through Funchal's streets provides encounters with local residents whose courtesy reflects Portuguese hospitality rather than imperial deference. Merchants offer tropical fruits and local crafts at prices that treat the former emperor as any other foreign visitor seeking respite in Madeira's therapeutic climate. Children playing in village squares regard him as simply another elderly gentleman whose presence has become part of their familiar landscape, their games continuing without acknowledgement of historical significance. Portuguese officials who manage his residence arrangements treat him with professional competence unmarked by elaborate protocols that once governed any interaction with Habsburg authority. Medical consultations are conducted in simple offices where local physicians provide care based on clinical assessment rather than imperial ceremony. Prescriptions are filled at neighbourhood pharmacies where Habsburg names appear alongside those of merchants, farmers and colonial administrators seeking treatment for tropical ailments. By midday, Charles retreats to a modest study where maps of his former territories now serve as historical curiosities rather than administrative tools. Books borrowed from the local library provide perspectives on European developments where Habsburg concerns have become academically interesting rather than politically relevant. The new national boundaries that have replaced imperial territories represent ethnic identities that proved stronger than centuries of dynastic loyalty, their democratic governments pursuing policies that serve local interests rather than imperial coordination. His afternoon correspondence includes letters to fellow exiles who have discovered that meaningful existence can be sustained through personal contribution rather than inherited authority. Former imperial administrators work as language teachers and commercial translators, while displaced aristocrats pursue careers in banking and international commerce that utilize their cultural knowledge within democratic economic systems. Their collective experience demonstrates human adaptability to circumstances that previous generations could never have contemplated. The island's medical facilities provide treatment that reflects advancing healthcare knowledge, rather than the elaborate court medicine that once surrounded imperial health concerns. Local physicians trained in Portuguese universities offer care based on scientific principles rather than ceremonial tradition, while their diagnostic methods incorporate recent medical innovations that have improved treatment outcomes for patients regardless of social background. The democratization of medical care extends to every aspect of health management, from routine consultations to specialized treatments. Evening meals are conducted around simple tables where family members serve themselves from dishes prepared in modest kitchens. Local wine, produced from grapes grown in Madeira's volcanic soil, provides refreshment whose quality reflects regional expertise rather than imperial procurement from global sources. Conversations focus on immediate concerns and island community events rather than international politics or dynastic strategy, their content shaped by present circumstances rather than historical memory. The evening entertainment consists of reading Portuguese newspapers that carry reports about European developments, where former Habsburg territories have achieved stability under democratic governments. Radio broadcasts bring news of a world where imperial concerns have become historically irrelevant, while musical programs feature compositions that celebrate popular culture rather than aristocratic patronage. The technological innovations that enable global communication demonstrate human progress that continues regardless of political transformation. Charles retires to a bedroom whose furnishings reflect local craftsmanship adapted to subtropical conditions. Wooden furniture made from island timber provides practical comfort rather than ceremonial grandeur, while cotton bedding woven in Portuguese mills offers appropriate climate protection without imperial luxury. The simplicity of his sleeping arrangements contrasts dramatically with the elaborate chambers that once accommodated imperial rest, yet provides adequate comfort for peaceful sleep. His evening prayers include gratitude for the island sanctuary that has provided refuge during his final months, while seeking spiritual guidance for the transition from earthly concerns to eternal considerations. The weight of mortality has replaced the burden of imperial responsibility, yet both require wisdom that draws from sources beyond human understanding. The approaching end of his personal journey parallels the completed transformation of European civilization. From dynastic authority to democratic governance, the villa settles into nighttime quiet that reflects the peaceful rhythms of island life, rather than the complex protocols that once governed imperial households. Ocean waves provide natural rhythms that have continued unchanged throughout human history, their persistence demonstrating natural forces that transcend political institutions. The stars visible through bedroom windows illuminate the same constellations that guided Habsburg ancestors during their rise to power, yet now witness the conclusion of dynastic authority that once seemed permanent. Through the following weeks, Charles's condition gradually deteriorates despite the therapeutic climate that has attracted European invalids to Madeira for generations. Local physicians provide palliative care that emphasizes comfort rather than desperate attempts to preserve imperial life through extraordinary measures. Family members gather from various exile locations to provide companionship during final days that unfold according to natural processes rather than state ceremony. The island community observes his decline with respectful sympathy that reflects human compassion rather than political deference. Local priests offer spiritual comfort based on universal religious principles rather than elaborate theological justifications for dynastic authority. Funeral preparations proceed according to Portuguese customs, adapted to accommodate the distinguished visitor's background, while maintaining democratic simplicity that has characterized his exile experience. News of his death travels by steamship and telegraph to European capitals, where former subjects receive the information as historical closure rather than political crisis. Newspapers report his passing with respectful obituaries that emphasize personal character rather than imperial achievement, while democratic governments issue diplomatic condolences that treat Habsburg history as concluded rather than continuing political concern. The absence of succession crisis demonstrates that European stability no longer depends on dynastic continuity. The funeral conducted in Funchal's cathedral reflects the island's Portuguese Catholic traditions rather than elaborate Habsburg ceremony, while local residents attend as neighbours rather than subjects. Military honours provided by Portuguese forces acknowledge historical significance without implying political restoration, their protocol designed for diplomatic courtesy rather than imperial recognition. The burial in Madeira soil represents the final integration of Habsburg legacy into democratic European civilization. Letters of condolence arrive from fellow exiles who have rebuilt their lives within democratic societies, their messages emphasizing personal loss rather than dynastic tragedy. Former imperial officials express gratitude for leadership that provided dignity during impossible circumstances, while displaced aristocrats acknowledge the grace with which he accepted transformation from emperor to private citizen. Their collective testimony demonstrates that human character can transcend political circumstances. The villa that served as his final residence returns to quiet occupation by subsequent tenants who appreciate its subtropical location rather than historical significance. Local residents remember their distinguished neighbour with affection that reflects personal interaction rather than imperial awe, while island life continues according to rhythms that have sustained Portuguese communities for centuries. The democratic institutions that govern Madeira function effectively without reference to Habsburg precedent or dynastic tradition. Estate settlement proceeds according to Portuguese legal procedures that treat imperial inheritance as private property rather than state treasure, while family members divide modest possessions that represent personal significance rather than political authority. Books, letters, and personal effects provide historical documentation rather than continuing governmental resources, their preservation serving scholarly rather than administrative purposes. The complete privatization of Habsburg legacy demonstrates the thoroughness of European transition to democratic governance. The clockmaking workshop in Switzerland continues its operations under Herr Müller's guidance, while the tools and techniques that Charles learned during his apprenticeship serve village timekeeping needs without reference to their imperial student. Repaired timepieces measure agricultural schedules and commercial appointments according to practical requirements rather than ceremonial protocol, their accuracy serving democratic communities that coordinate activities through voluntary cooperation rather than hierarchical command. The transferability of useful skills demonstrates human capacity for constructive contribution regardless of political background. Former Habsburg territories achieve increasing prosperity under democratic governments that respond to popular needs rather than dynastic preference, while their citizens develop national identities that incorporate historical appreciation without political restoration. Czech farmers report improved agricultural conditions. Hungarian merchants describe expanded business opportunities, and Yugoslav communities celebrate cultural development that reflects ethnic heritage rather than imperial coordination. The success of democratic transition provides evidence that human societies can thrive without aristocratic leadership. The Alpine village where Charles spent his early exile continues its seasonal routines guided by natural cycles rather than political calendar, while community institutions demonstrate democratic capacity for self-governance through voluntary participation. Local schools educate children for citizenship in societies where individual merit determines advancement opportunities, while village councils manage public affairs through elected representation rather than inherited authority. The vitality of democratic communities reveals organizational possibilities that transcend traditional hierarchical structures. European universities develop historical programs that study Habsburg legacy as completed phenomenon rather than continuing political force, while scholars analyze dynastic evolution according to scientific methods that emphasize empirical evidence rather than propagandistic justification. Archives preserve imperial documentation for research purposes that serve academic inquiry rather than governmental administration, their organization reflecting democratic values that prioritize public access over elite privilege. The academic treatment of Habsburg history demonstrates intellectual freedom that flourishes within democratic societies. International relations proceed according to principles that emphasize popular sovereignty rather than dynastic inheritance, while diplomatic negotiations address practical concerns about trade, security, and cultural exchange, rather than territorial claims based on historical precedent. The League of Nations develops procedures for peaceful conflict resolution that rely on legal principles rather than aristocratic mediation, while member states pursue policies determined by domestic political processes rather than imperial coordination. The institutionalization of democratic diplomacy provides alternatives to traditional balance of power politics. Technological innovations continue advancing human capabilities, regardless of political transformation, while scientific research proceeds according to empirical methods that transcend national boundaries and social hierarchies. Radio communication enables global information exchange that serves democratic education rather than imperial propaganda, while transportation improvements facilitate international commerce that operates through market mechanisms rather than political privilege. The acceleration of human progress demonstrates possibilities that emerge when intellectual resources are liberated from aristocratic restriction. Cultural development flourishes within democratic societies where artistic expression reflects popular creativity rather than court patronage, while educational institutions provide opportunities for individual development that serve personal fulfillment rather than dynastic service. Literature, music, and visual arts explore themes that celebrate human potential rather than aristocratic achievement, while their accessibility demonstrates democratic commitment to cultural participation by entire populations rather than elite minorities. The democratization of culture reveals creative possibilities that emerge when artistic resources are distributed according to merit rather than inherited privilege. The European transformation from imperial authority to democratic governance represents completed historical evolution that has created foundations for continued human development based on principles of individual dignity and popular sovereignty. Former Habsburg territories achieve stability through institutions that serve ethnic communities rather than dynastic coordination, while their prosperity demonstrates that human societies can thrive when organized according to democratic rather than aristocratic principles. The success of this transformation provides evidence that political change can occur peacefully when supported by populations prepared for democratic participation. The legacy of Habsburg authority endures through historical appreciation rather than political continuation, while the human qualities that enable dynastic success find expression within democratic societies that reward competence rather than inheritance. Individual character transcends political circumstances, while useful skills contribute to community welfare regardless of their practitioners' social origins. The adaptability demonstrated by Habsburg exiles provides evidence of human resilience that enables meaningful existence within any social organization that respects personal dignity and provides opportunities for constructive contribution. The sun sets on Habsburg imperial authority, not through violent revolution, but through peaceful evolution toward democratic governance that better serves human needs and aspirations. The dynasty that once dominated European politics has been absorbed into historical memory, while the territories they governed achieve prosperity through institutions that reflect popular will rather than hereditary tradition. The transformation represents completed political development that has created foundations for continued human progress based on principles that recognize individual worth and collective responsibility for community welfare. Welfare. The morning sun of 1925 rises over a transformed Europe, where the very concept of empire has become a museum curiosity. In the quiet reading rooms of the British Museum, Professor Heinrich von Habsburg, great-grandson of emperors, arrives each morning at precisely 9 o'clock to catalogue medieval manuscripts, whose illuminated pages once proclaimed the divine right of kings. His daily routine begins with the same methodical precision that once characterized imperial administration, yet now serves the democratic institution of public scholarship rather than dynastic authority. Heinrich removes his simple wool overcoat in the staff cloakroom, where university graduates from across Europe hang their garments beside his own. The egalitarian arrangement of personal belongings reflects institutional values that prioritize scholarly merit over aristocratic heritage, while conversations conducted in multiple languages demonstrate the international cooperation that has replaced imperial competition. His leather satchel contains notebooks whose careful organization reflects habits inherited from generations of administrators, yet now serves academic research rather than governmental coordination. The manuscript room where Heinrich spends his days houses treasures that once adorned Habsburg libraries, their presence in London reflecting the dispersal of imperial collections through democratic institutions committed to public access rather than private ownership. Illuminated psalters created for medieval emperors now serve researchers whose investigations seek historical understanding rather than political justification, while their preservation demonstrates scholarly dedication to cultural heritage that transcends national boundaries. His morning routine includes consultation with cataloguing systems that reflect modern library science rather than aristocratic preference, their systematic organization enabling efficient research by scholars whose academic credentials matter more than social background. The democratic principles that govern intellectual access ensure that knowledge once restricted to imperial courts now serves educational institutions throughout European society, while collaborative research projects demonstrate scientific cooperation that has replaced dynastic rivalry. Fellow scholars who share Heinrich's workspace represent diverse academic backgrounds rather than aristocratic connections, their expertise earned through university education that emphasizes intellectual achievement over inherited privilege. Conversations conducted over morning coffee address research methodologies and historical interpretation according to empirical standards that demand evidence rather than authority, while their collaborative approach reflects democratic values that prioritize collective understanding over individual preference. The manuscripts Heinrich examines contain chronicles that once celebrated Habsburg achievements, their ornate calligraphy and golden illuminations representing artistic traditions that served imperial propaganda rather than objective documentation. His scholarly analysis approaches these texts as historical sources, whose value lies in evidential content rather than ceremonial significance, while his methodical transcription serves academic preservation rather than dynastic commemoration. Medieval charters that once transferred territories between imperial authorities now provide evidence for scholarly investigations into economic and social development rather than political legitimacy, their legal language reflecting assumptions about hierarchical authority that have been superseded by democratic institutions. Heinrich's paleographic skills enable accurate transcription of documents whose content illuminates social conditions rather than justifying aristocratic privilege, while his linguistic expertise serves historical scholarship rather than diplomatic correspondence. By midday, Heinrich joins colleagues in the museum cafeteria, where institutional democracy extends to dining arrangements that seat professors alongside junior researchers without regard for academic rank or social background. Conversations range across scholarly topics that reflect international research cooperation rather than national competition, while their exchanges demonstrate intellectual freedom that flourishes within democratic societies committed to open inquiry rather than ideological restriction. Afternoon sessions involve collaboration with visiting scholars, whose research interests connect British collections to archival materials preserved in democratic institutions throughout Europe. Their cooperative methodology reflecting academic values that transcend political boundaries. International correspondence facilitates scholarly exchange that serves educational advancement rather than diplomatic negotiation, while shared research protocols demonstrate scientific standards that apply universal principles regardless of national origin. The library's public reading rooms accommodate researchers from diverse social backgrounds whose access reflects a democratic commitment to educational opportunity rather than aristocratic privilege. Their investigations serving personal intellectual development rather than inherited obligation. Students pursuing advanced degrees work alongside independent scholars whose research contributes to collective knowledge rather than individual advancement, while their collaborative atmosphere demonstrates democratic ideals that value merit over birth circumstances. Heinrich's evening routine includes preparation of scholarly articles whose publication serves academic discourse rather than political advocacy, their content subject to peer review that ensures intellectual rigor rather than social acceptability. Editorial processes reflect democratic principles that evaluate scholarship according to evidential standards rather than author credentials, while international publication networks demonstrate scholarly cooperation that transcends traditional political divisions. The manuscript preservation workshop, where Heinrich occasionally assists, employs conservation techniques that serve cultural heritage rather than dynastic commemoration. Their methods developed through scientific research rather than traditional craft knowledge. Specialized equipment enables precise restoration work that preserves historical documents for future scholarship rather than ceremonial display, while training programs prepare conservators whose expertise serves public institutions rather than private collectors. Evening lectures at the Royal Historical Society bring together scholars whose research addresses questions that serve educational advancement rather than political justification. Their presentations subject to academic discussion that emphasizes evidence rather than authority. Heinrich's occasional contributions reflect expertise developed through systematic study rather than inherited knowledge. While audience participation demonstrates democratic values that encourage open intellectual exchange regardless of social background, his modest flat in Bloomsbury contains books and papers that reflect scholarly interests rather than ancestral obligation, their organization serving research efficiency rather than ceremonial display. Personal correspondence maintains connections with fellow researchers whose academic careers serve educational institutions rather than governmental administration, while their exchanges focus on intellectual questions rather than political concerns. Weekend visits to country archives provide access to local collections whose preservation reflects community commitment to historical heritage rather than aristocratic tradition, their organization serving scholarly research rather than family commemoration. Village historians whose expertise develops through passionate inquiry rather than professional training contribute valuable insights that demonstrate democratic principles extending to intellectual activity at every social level. The seasonal rhythm of academic conferences brings Heinrich into contact with international scholars whose research addresses common questions through cooperative methodology rather than competitive rivalry, their presentations contributing to collective understanding rather than individual recognition. Professional relationships develop through shared intellectual interests rather than social connections, while collaborative projects demonstrate academic values that transcend traditional hierarchical distinctions. University teaching opportunities allow Heinrich to share paleographic expertise with students whose career goals reflect democratic society's educational possibilities rather than aristocratic limitation. Their academic preparation serving professional advancement within meritocratic institutions rather than inherited privilege. Classroom discussions encourage critical thinking that serves intellectual development rather than ideological conformity, while examination standards apply objective criteria rather than social preference. Research grants awarded through competitive application processes reflect democratic principles that distribute resources according to scholarly merit rather than political influence, while funding decisions serve educational advancement rather than institutional tradition. International cooperation enables access to archival collections that serve academic investigation rather than diplomatic negotiation, while shared research protocols demonstrate scientific standards that transcend national boundaries. The British Museum's democratic governance structure provides institutional framework that serves public education rather than elite preference, while policy decisions reflect scholarly expertise rather than political authority. Staff appointments prioritize academic qualifications over social connections, while administrative procedures serve institutional mission rather than hierarchical tradition. Heinrich's daily contributions to manuscript cataloguing serve scholarly accessibility rather than administrative control, while his expertise enables research possibilities that benefit international academic community rather than national interest. Professional satisfaction derives from intellectual achievement rather than inherited status, while personal identity reflects scholarly accomplishment rather than aristocratic heritage. Evening walks through London streets reveal urban development that serves democratic society rather than imperial grandeur, while public institutions provide cultural resources accessible to entire population rather than elite minority. Museums, libraries, and universities demonstrate civic commitment to educational opportunity that serves individual development rather than social restriction, while their accessibility reflects democratic values that prioritize collective welfare over inherited privilege. The transformation of European society from imperial authority to democratic governance has created institutional foundations that enable scholarly activity serving human understanding rather than political justification, while intellectual freedom flourishes within social organization that rewards competence rather than birth circumstances. Heinrich's adaptation from aristocratic heritage to academic career demonstrates human capacity for meaningful contribution regardless of political transformation, while his scholarly work serves educational advancement that benefits democratic society rather than dynastic commemoration. Local bookshops that Heinrich frequents provide access to international publications whose content reflects scholarly freedom rather than political restriction, while their democratic organization serves customer preference rather than ideological control. Reading groups that meet in neighborhood establishments demonstrate intellectual activity that serves personal development rather than social distinction, while their discussions reflect democratic values that encourage open exchange regardless of educational background. Professional conferences held in university venues throughout Europe provide opportunities for scholarly exchange that serves academic advancement rather than diplomatic negotiation, while their democratic organization ensures participation based on intellectual merit rather than political influence. Research presentations address questions that serve human understanding rather than national interest, while collaborative discussions demonstrate scientific cooperation that transcends traditional political divisions. The archive preservation projects that Heinrich occasionally supports serve cultural heritage rather than dynastic commemoration, while conservation techniques protect historical documents for democratic access rather than elite privilege. International cooperation enables resource sharing that serves scholarly investigation rather than political advantage, while professional standards ensure preservation quality that serves future generations rather than contemporary preference. Heinrich's correspondence with former Habsburg territories reveals successful adaptation to democratic governance that serves popular welfare rather than aristocratic tradition, while cultural institutions preserve historical heritage through scholarly investigation rather than political justification. Educational developments reflect democratic commitment to intellectual opportunity that serves individual advancement rather than social restriction, while academic freedom enables research that addresses human questions rather than ideological requirements. The evening routine that concludes Heinrich's days reflects personal satisfaction derived from scholarly contribution rather than inherited obligation, while his academic identity serves educational advancement rather than family tradition. Professional relationships develop through shared intellectual interests rather than social connections, while collaborative research demonstrates democratic values that prioritize collective understanding over individual recognition. The quiet dignity of scholarly work provides meaningful existence that serves human knowledge rather than political authority, while intellectual achievement offers satisfaction that transcends social transformation. Heinrich's daily routine demonstrates that useful contribution can sustain personal identity regardless of political circumstances, while his academic career serves democratic society rather than aristocratic tradition. The manuscript room settles into evening quiet as researchers complete their daily investigations, their scholarly work serving educational advancement rather than political justification. Historical documents preserved through democratic institutions provide evidence for human understanding rather than dynastic commemoration, while their accessibility demonstrates civic commitment to intellectual freedom that serves entire population rather than elite minority. Through the tall windows of the British Museum, London's evening lights illuminate urban development that serves democratic society rather than imperial grandeur, while public institutions provide cultural resources that reflect collective commitment to educational opportunity. The transformation from aristocratic privilege to democratic access has created possibilities for human development that transcend traditional social limitations, while scholarly investigation serves understanding that benefits entire civilization rather than particular interests. Heinrich's personal journey from aristocratic heritage to academic achievement demonstrates adaptability that enables meaningful contribution regardless of political transformation, while his scholarly expertise serves educational advancement that reflects democratic values rather than dynastic tradition. The quiet satisfaction of intellectual work provides purpose that transcends social circumstances, while professional accomplishment offers dignity that serves human understanding rather than inherited status. The manuscripts that Heinrich catalogues will continue serving scholarly research long after their original political significance has been forgotten, while their preservation demonstrates democratic commitment to cultural heritage that serves future generations rather than contemporary preference. The institutional framework that enables such scholarly work reflects civic dedication to educational advancement that transcends traditional social divisions, while intellectual freedom flourishes within democratic society that rewards merit rather than birth circumstances. The year 1938 brings autumn shadows across the courtyard of Mariazell Abbey, where Brother Gottfried tends the monastery gardens with methodical precision learned through decades of Benedictine routine. His weathered hands, once soft with aristocratic privilege, now bear the calluses of honest labour as he harvests late vegetables that will sustain the monastic community through another alpine winter. The morning bells that summon him to prayer echo the same bronze tones that once called his ancestors to imperial ceremonies, yet now serve purely spiritual purposes divorced from worldly authority. His cell contains only essential furnishings befitting monastic poverty: a narrow wooden bed, a simple pine desk, and shelves lined with theological texts whose margins bear careful annotations in his precise handwriting. The morning routine begins before dawn with private prayer conducted in Latin that connects him to centuries of Christian contemplation, while the breviary that guides his devotions reflects universal religious tradition rather than Habsburg ceremonial. His brown Benedictine habit, woven from rough wool by the monastery's own workshops, replaces the silk and velvet that once marked his imperial heritage. The monastery's scriptorium provides refuge where Brother Gottfried applies paleographic skills inherited from his scholarly ancestors to copying manuscripts that serve religious education rather than political documentation. His careful calligraphy preserves sacred texts whose spiritual content transcends the temporal concerns that once dominated Habsburg correspondence, while illuminated capitals decorated with traditional motifs celebrate divine rather than dynastic authority. The vellum pages beneath his quill will carry prayers and theological commentary to parish churches throughout the Austrian countryside. Fellow monks who share his daily routine represent diverse social backgrounds, united by religious vocation rather than aristocratic connection, their brotherhood reflecting Christian equality that supersedes worldly distinction. Conversations conducted in monastery corridors address spiritual development and communal responsibilities according to Benedictine principles that emphasize humility rather than inherited privilege, while their collaborative work demonstrates religious values that serve divine worship rather than human ambition. The community kitchen, where Brother Gottfried assists with meal preparation, employs techniques that transform simple ingredients into nourishing sustenance through careful attention and grateful prayer. Root vegetables grown in monastery gardens combine with grains purchased from local farmers to create meals that satisfy physical needs while reflecting spiritual appreciation for divine providence. His kitchen duties include bread baking, whose rhythmic kneading provides meditative focus that calms worldly concerns while producing essential nourishment for religious community. Morning chapters conducted in the monastery's chapter house address communal business according to democratic procedures that give each monk voice in decisions affecting their shared life, while discussions emphasize practical concerns about agricultural planning, building maintenance, and charitable obligations to surrounding villages. Brother Gottfried's contributions reflect experience gained through administrative training, yet his recommendations serve religious purposes rather than governmental objectives. The monastery's library contains theological collections that Brother Gottfried helps organize according to systematic principles that serve scholarly research rather than ceremonial display, their arrangement facilitating access by visiting academics whose investigations address religious questions rather than political justification. Medieval manuscripts, preserved through monastic dedication, provide evidence for ecclesiastical history that serves educational advancement rather than dynastic commemoration, while conservation work protects cultural heritage for future generations. Afternoon agricultural work brings Brother Gottfried into contact with seasonal rhythms that have sustained monastic communities throughout centuries of political transformation, their continuity demonstrating spiritual foundations that transcend worldly change. Apple orchards planted by previous generations provide fruit whose harvest requires collective effort that strengthens community bonds while producing resources for charitable distribution to local families experiencing economic difficulty. The monastery's workshop, where Brother Gottfried occasionally assists, produces religious articles that serve parish churches throughout the region rather than imperial ceremony. Their simple craftsmanship reflecting spiritual values that prioritize function over ornamental display. Wooden crosses carved from local timber carry devotional significance that transcends artistic sophistication, while their distribution demonstrates religious commitment to serving rural congregations, regardless of their financial resources. Evening prayers conducted in the Abbey Church unite monastic voices in Gregorian chant that connects contemporary worship to centuries of Christian tradition, their harmonies rising toward vaulted ceilings that have witnessed countless generations of religious devotion. Brother Gottfried's participation in this daily office provides spiritual nourishment that sustains religious identity based on divine service rather than worldly achievement, while communal worship demonstrates Christian unity that transcends social background. And so, we reach the end of our gentle journey through the corridors of time. where we've witnessed the remarkable transformation of Europe's most enduring dynasty. From Rudolph's modest Alpine castle to the global empire of Charles V, from Maria Theresa's enlightened reforms to the final exile in Madeira, we've walked alongside the Habsburgs as they shaped and were shaped by the currents of history. Their story reminds us that even the mightiest empires eventually fade into memory, yet the human capacity for adaptation and dignity endures. Sweet dreams, friend, and may you rest peacefully, knowing that all things pass, but the stories remain to guide us through the quiet night.